So, in this episode, I would like to explore the origins of certain of the world's major religious traditions, and I'm particularly interested here in understanding what it is that we can learn about the origins of these more venerable, established religious traditions by studying the phenomena of so-called new religious movements. So, new religious movements, or NRMs, as I will refer to them throughout the rest of this episode, are sort of floppily defined, I think, in a lot of the scholarly literature. As the name would suggest, of course, a new religious movement is a religious movement that has been developed in comparatively recent times. So basically all of the traditions that are studied under this label have arisen in the past 200 years or so. But beyond the fact that these movements are religious and that they are new, there isn't a lot we can say about the nature of NRMs, or to provide a really exhaustive definition of what an NRM is, and that's because these NRMs come in a wide variety of forms. There are many different kinds of NRMs that have been developed in different contexts, which make different kinds of claims, which form different kinds of religious organizations and religious groups and so on. And indeed, many of the phenomena that have been classified as NRMs would actually reject that label for themselves. So, as we'll see later in the episode, a lot of NRMs are actually developed consciously as a kind of purification or as a kind of extension of an existing religious tradition. So, the Jehovah's Witness movement, for example, this is typically classified as an NRM because it emerged in the 19th century, but Jehovah's Witnesses would not like that label to be applied to them. They believe that they represent the truest, purest form of Christianity that there is. They believe that their beliefs can be traced back to the very first century of Christianity, so they would reject the new religious movement label because they don't believe that they are new. They believe that they are merely a return to the original roots of Christianity. So the classification of certain traditions as NRMs comes with some controversy. There's also the problem that NRMs can take a number of forms, so they are birthed in very different circumstances. They give rise to very different kinds of organizations and different kinds of groups, as we will see later in the episode. So NRM is a kind of loose label, but for now all we need to know is that these are religious traditions that have been developed comparatively recently. They are typically identified, if not by the believers in these groups themselves, then at least by wider society, as a kind of religious innovation. They are not just the continuation or a different expression of an already existing faith, but rather they are seen as representing a new and independent tradition in themselves. Now, you might of course ask why it might be that studying NRMs might help us to understand the origins of much more ancient faiths, and the reason, I think, is actually quite simple, and that is that all religious traditions that I'm familiar with follow very similar sorts of patterns. So if you go back to the first 3 episodes I recorded on this channel about the nature of religion, there are going to be a lot of similarities that I've identified there in terms of the similarities that all religious traditions share with respect to religious concepts, the nature of the groups that they form, the nature of their institutions, and so on. There's also evidence from the cognitive science of religion, which I have also recorded an episode about, which suggests that really the human imagination is sort of limited in the kinds of concepts that it can create. Human psychology falls into certain predictable patterns, so anything that human psychology develops, including religion, is going to be really just a variation on what we have already seen before. There are certain limits to the kind of things that human beings can create, and so all religious traditions rehash very similar themes, they develop very similar sorts of concepts, they organize themselves into very similar sorts of groups with very similar sorts of practices, and so on. And moreover, of course, human psychology really hasn't changed that much in the last 3,000 or 4,000 years. So if we understand what it is that motivates the development of an NRM in the contemporary world, I believe that that can also help us to understand the development of a much more ancient religious tradition, because human psychology in the year 2025 and in the year 2025 BC are not radically different. Now, believers will of course reject this charge. Every believer who sees themselves as existing within a particular religious tradition holds that that religious tradition is somehow special, that it exclusively is somehow in possession of deep and profound truths that no other system of human thought has been able to generate. Many religious traditions will also claim for themselves a kind of miraculous origin of the faith. So there might be the claim of divine intervention or something like this. So, of course, believers themselves are not going to accept that new religious movements can give us any insight into the origin of their particular faith, because, of course, their faith is special. How can you possibly look at an NRM with all of their silly beliefs, with all of their fraudulent practices, and suggest that this can somehow be used to explain a miraculous intervention by God in history? So, one thing I'll stress is that these sorts of claims are not unique to the established, venerable religious traditions. NRMs make exactly the same sorts of claims. NRMs also claim that they are in possession uniquely of some special truth. They very often claim to have originated with some miraculous event. So what we have to be clear about is that the rhetoric surrounding the origins of all religious movements, whether old or new, are very, very similar. They all believe that they are special. They all believe that they are not reducible to basic material facts, and they all believe that they deserve to be treated on their own merits. But by studying religion in general, as opposed to just one particular religion, again, because we can see these themes arise again and again, it suggests that there can be a sort of general theory. There is something about human psychology or human socialization which produces religious movements routinely, and that these religious movements are predicated on and justified by very similar sorts of arguments, very similar appeals to authority, very similar appeals to miraculous goings-on, and so on. So a Christian, for example, might believe that there is something genuinely special about the origins of Christianity, and they might point to the life and the resurrection of Jesus Christ as evidence for this. So they'll point to his particular miraculous deeds, for example, as evidence that there was something special going on at the time. They'll point to his resurrection and the belief of his followers that he had been resurrected, and their recounting of their resurrection experiences as sort of special, unique historical data points. So you can't just come at Christianity with this general theory of how religion works, because according to the rhetoric of Christian origins within the Christian faith, there was something singularly special that was going on. But the problem is that all of the claims that have been made about Jesus, have also been made about men who have lived in the past 200 years. So if we look at his miraculous dealings, for example, there are many so-called gurus or sants within the Hindu tradition in India who also perform miraculous deeds as a matter of course on a daily basis. There are plenty of videos on YouTube portraying these miraculous deeds. So if you think about the Satya Sai Baba movement, for example, in India, this was founded by a guy called Satya Sai Baba who claimed to be, well, divine, basically. And he performed a number of miracles in front of his supporters. And again, you can witness them on YouTube. I don't find anything particularly impressive about them. But the point is that even in this age, which is dominated by technology, by video cameras, by mobile phones, and so on, there are still people who will make miraculous claims for themselves. They will claim to be able to heal the sick, they will claim to be able to manifest gold, as Satya Sai Baba did, and so on. There have also been many accounts in NRMs of people being resurrected from the dead. So an interesting example here is one provided by T.M. Lerman in her book, How God Becomes Real, where she recounts the experiences of a particular sect of Hasidic Jews who were under the influence of a very charismatic rabbi who claimed to be immortal and I think even claimed to be the Messiah. Now, predictably enough, as with everybody else who claims to be immortal, this guy ended up dying. But the interesting thing is that his believers began to recount having very, very vivid experiences of this resurrected rabbi. And the rabbi would appear to them at night. He would give them very concrete, very specific prophecies by which they could live their lives. And so again, there is nothing particularly special about the resurrection of Jesus. This is something that has been claimed for many men throughout history. And of course, there are different kinds of resurrections, but there have been many examples of men who, after their death, have been venerated as gods, who people have seen walking around and communicating with others. So again, there is nothing remotely special about the claim at the center of Christianity that the resurrection of Jesus was a unique historical event. Now, of course, a Christian is going to claim that the distinction here is that the miracles done by particular gurus in India or the resurrection of a Hasidic rabbi are not the same as the resurrection of Jesus, because they would claim the resurrection of Jesus actually happened, whereas the purported miracles and resurrections in NRMs are self-evidently bunk. Well, if we are approaching religion from a scholarly perspective, then we can't actually privilege the claims of one particular religious tradition over another. The claim of the resurrection of Jesus, the claim of the resurrection of this rabbi, have identical empirical evidence, I would say. There is lots of eyewitness testimonies in both cases. So there is absolutely no basis for a genuinely impartial scholar to say that there is some merit, some historical merit to the Christian claims of the resurrection, while dismissing the claims of this group of Hasidic Jews. So, since the scholar is required to take this stance of principled agnosticism with respect to any particular religious claim, we then have to ask, well, what is it actually that is motivating these kinds of beliefs? So if we have a recurring pattern in which people believe that there are certain special people in the world who are capable of performing miracles, who are capable of being resurrected and appearing to followers after their death, then what is actually motivating this? And if we can understand what is motivating this group of Hasidic Jews to believe that they are talking to their resurrected rabbi, that might also help us. In fact, I think it definitely does help us in understanding why the earliest Christians believed that Jesus had been resurrected and why they believed that they were able to talk to him, why others around them would find these claims at all credible, and so on. And this is the advantage of studying NRMs, because the people who are making these incredible religious claims are actually alive. We can study them, we can talk to them, we can try to understand what is motivating their beliefs. So, of course, when we study the origins of Christianity, we are really studying an event that is very historically distant. The extant sources detailing what the earliest Christians believed are sort of fragmentary. They are governed by a lot of mythical constructions, obviously, in the way that they are related. So it would be very difficult, I think, to speculate on what was motivating the earliest Christians to make the claims that they did without looking at the similar claims which are made by living flesh and blood people in the contemporary world. And that is not to say that we have to ignore the particular histories of particular religious traditions when we try to understand how they developed. So, of course, if you want to understand Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Judaism, and so on, and how all of these religious traditions actually emerged, they did obviously emerge in very particular circumstances. So there is a limit to how much we can learn about these religious traditions just by studying these general religious tendencies that we observe in the contemporary world. But we should also not focus too much on the particular histories of these particular traditions because, as I just hinted at there, the sources which detail the origins of these traditions are of, to put it mildly, limited historical value. So the first problem we have is that we have very few independent historical sources which detail the origins of any of the world's major faiths. So if we look at Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Taoism, Confucianism, and so on, I'm unfamiliar with any genuinely independent third-party texts which we could use to try to understand the origins of these faiths. So the only sources that we have been written by people within the faith. And this doesn't mean that we have to throw out all of these endemic sources. There can still be nuggets of historical truth there, which, if we mine them carefully, we can still extract from the texts. But as I mentioned in an earlier episode on the nature of religious mythology, when religious people write down texts, when they create narratives, when they generate myths, even when it appears that they are attempting to write something like an objective history of their faith, it is simply inevitable that certain ideological biases or other kinds of biases are going to creep in to the construction of that text. And importantly, this doesn't just apply to religious texts or religious histories. So if, for example, you wanted to write a history of the presidency of Donald Trump, the way that this narrative is going to be structured is obviously going to differ a lot depending on your own political leanings, and it's going to be very difficult to suppress those ideological biases. And it doesn't mean that you are going to lie in the construction of your narrative or that you're going to make things up, even if everything that you include in that narrative is basically historically true. There is still the fact that you have to decide which particular historical events to include in your narrative and which ones not to. I mean, the world is, for all intents and purposes, infinitely complex. There are a basically infinite number of facts, and so the choosing of particular facts over others to include in the narrative is something that is going to be swayed by your own particular ideology, the particular spin that you put on facts, the way that certain facts are related together in the narrative. All of these are going to be subject to ideological biases of one kind or another. And this is the case even if we consider more ideologically inert histories. So if I was going to write a history of Jamaica, for example, probably the kind of things that I see fit to include in that narrative, or the kind of things that I find interesting, or the kind of things that I wish to focus on, are going to be different compared to what a Jamaican person might find interesting or important. The fact that I am a man as opposed to a woman is again maybe going to bias certain judgments I make about what to include in the narrative and what to exclude. It makes a difference whether you are old or young, or it makes a difference depending on whether you want to write a scholarly account or a more entertaining account, for example. All of these kinds of choices that an individual has to make in the construction of a historical narrative are always going to be a reflection of the particular biases, the personal individual biases that that person holds. And if this is true for more secular histories, then it's obviously going to be all the more true when we consider religious histories because of the emotional investment that people have in their religious tradition. So if someone exists within a religious tradition, they count themselves as members of that tradition, then they are obviously going to find the particular claims of that religious tradition to be singularly important, to be deeply meaningful, and to be true with a capital T. And so the kinds of histories that they write about the origins of their faith are going to be a reflection of the emotional investment they already have in the tradition itself. And so this means that when the history of a religious tradition is written from within that tradition, you're going to find some pretty predictable sorts of tropes. So things like the founders of these religious traditions, so the Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, and so on, these people are never going to be portrayed in the religious literature as being somehow stupid or weak, so any particular historical fact that might have been available to them certainly would not have been included within the narrative that they choose to create, and indeed these sorts of stories would have been suppressed very early on within the religious tradition. So by the time that the origins of the tradition came to be written down, there probably wasn't much knowledge of stories or facts which run contrary to the emerging orthodoxy of the faith. And the reason is pretty simple, that if you are inside this religious group, you are not going to repeat or circulate particular stories, particular facts, which undermine the authority or the integrity of the faith. So a lot of negative information is immediately going to be suppressed in the mythological construction of the origins of a religious tradition, and it's not for any nefarious reasons. It's not like there was some sort of censorship happening, or they were, invidiously attempting to suppress clear historical facts. It's just that a community is obviously going to circulate only those kinds of stories and facts which are conducive to its own ideology. That is how groups work. That is how information and facts circulate within a particular ideological bubble. So this bias in the sources that we have about the origins of most of the world's major religious traditions is one reason that these sources can't be trusted. Another reason is that typically these sources come much later. So within all of these religious traditions, we basically don't have any credible eyewitness testimony about what was actually happening at the time of the origins of these traditions. So the Gospels, for example, which portray the origins of Christianity, were written somewhere between probably 40 to 60 years after the death of Jesus. A lot of the historical narratives surrounding the origins of Islam are to be found in the so-called Sunnah literature in that faith, and the Ahadith in particular, which detail certain sayings and practices of Muhammad and his early followers, and the so-called occasions of revelation, so narratives which have been constructed to explain the kind of historical circumstances in which particular Quranic verses were created. All of these come much later. So I don't think there are any non-Muslim scholars that I'm familiar with who would suggest that the ahadith in Islam are a credible window into the earliest times of Islam, because they were typically constructed probably 100 to 150 years after the death of Muhammad, and they reflect the interests of a much later stage in the development of Islam. So while there might be some genuine sayings or practices of Muhammad that have been recorded in this literature, the fact is that because they are so late, because they are so clearly clouded by the particular theological and religious debates of later Islamic communities, we can't really put much stock in these texts as a reliable window into what the origins of Islam were really like. In Buddhism, the surviving accounts of the life of Buddha come later still. We're talking probably 300 or 400 years after the death of the Buddha. Clearly, a lot of the narratives about his life, about the kind of person he was, the kind of things he said and did, mythological constructions. The biography of the Buddha includes a lot of mythical tropes. There doesn't seem to be a lot of historical value in the surviving Buddhist sources about the nature of the earliest forms of Buddhism. The Deuteronomistic history, which details the origins of Judaism within the Bible. This was written probably around the year 600 BC, and it's describing events such as the revelation of the Ten Commandments or God's covenant with Moses, which would have taken place something like 600 or 700 years earlier. And again, if you go back to my episode on King Josiah, I talk there a little bit about why these sources cannot really be trusted. There is a very large mythological component to them, of course. So in all of these religious traditions, the sources are very late. They are, for that reason, of very limited historical value. And unfortunately, archaeology can't help us very much in this quest either. So we do have, very fragmentary evidence from the earliest times, certainly of Judaism and Islam, to a lesser extent Christianity, Buddhism and Hinduism. Their origins have unfortunately been lost to the ages in a material sense, but even those fragments that we have don't really give us very much insight into what the earliest communities of these faiths must have been like. So if we want to understand how it is that these faiths might have developed, we have to go beyond the historical sources, we have to go beyond the archaeology, and we have to find another way to understand how it might have been that all of these religious traditions actually developed. And this is, of course, why I believe that the study of NRMs can give us some insight into what might have actually happened in the development of all of these world traditions, because, as I said, there are very clear patterns in the way that NRMs develop. This should give us some confidence that the kind of forces and social pressures and psychological biases which create commitment to NRMs in the contemporary world can also be used to understand the origins of the major world religious traditions. And obviously, a lot of what I'm about to say is going to be a little bit speculative. The fact is that we will never know what happened at the origins of any of these faiths. So all I'm trying to do here is to provide a kind of credible and realistic account of how it is that the faiths might have developed, but this is not to say that I know exactly what happened, because obviously I don't, and neither does anyone else. So if we want to use NRMs as a way of understanding how it was that the established religious traditions actually developed, the first thing, of course, we need to do is to look at how it is that NRMs develop. And the first thing to look at here are the different kinds of organizations and the different kinds of structures that NRMs evince, because different kinds of NRMs, different kinds of religious organizations, evolve in different ways and for different reasons. So I think that a very useful diagnostic tool to use to this end is Howard Becker's fourfold typology of the kinds of different structures that religions all over the world typically evince. So I don't necessarily believe that his fourfold typology is exhaustive, that this is the only way to think about NRMs and how they are formed, but I do think it is very useful. So I'm going to be quoting here from a chapter entitled Categorizing Religious Organizations in the Oxford Handbook of New Religious Movements. So this text suggests that Becker divided religious organizations into four basic forms, namely the ecclesia, the sect, the denomination, and the cult. So, according to Becker, all religious traditions can be basically fit into one of these four categories. As we'll see, the boundaries between these categories is a bit blurred. There are a number of traditions where it's a little bit difficult to know exactly which of these four groups they are to be classified into, but he supposed that this was a sort of universal typology. So, if you are faced with the emergence of an NRM, or you want to study a particular religious movement, you can put that movement into one of these four groups, which all evince different organizational forms. So two of these types don't really concern us here, so the ecclesia and the denomination, these refer to religious traditions that are already well established, which have a robust sense of identity connected with them, which have a robust and concrete set of institutions, which have particular dogmatic beliefs, which all within the tradition are expected to follow, and so on. So these do not apply to NRMs. They only refer to already well-established religious traditions, which have had sufficient time to develop a robust orthodoxy and a robust orthopraxy. So the two that we're interested in here are the sect and the cult. So basically, if you have an NRM, it can typically be put into one of these two groups. And it's important here to recognize that these are intended as neutral labels, so sometimes the words sect and cult can have a very pejorative meaning in everyday discourse. I mean, if you refer to a particular tradition as a cult, that normally doesn't signal approbation, but the way that it's used here is in a neutral sense, and they refer to basically the two different ways that a new religious movement can develop its particular beliefs and its particular practices. So the text that I mentioned earlier defines these religious types as follows. So it defines a sect as, quote, exclusivist religious groups seeking to preserve the purity of their root tradition, end quote, and a cult as, quote, loosely organized amorphous groups that offer experiential spiritual benefits such as salvation, healing, and ecstatic experiences to adherents, end quote. So we'll go into a bit more detail as we go along about what this really means, but for now you can basically imagine a sect as a kind of continuation of an existing religious tradition, which typically views itself as a kind of revivalist movement or as a return to the original principles of that faith. So in Christianity, we'd be looking at something like Jehovah's Witnesses. In Judaism, we'd be looking at Hasidic Judaism. In Islam, we might look at something like the Salafi movement. So in all of these religious traditions, which were all created within the past few hundred years, there is this very definite rhetoric that these traditions represent the sort of pure, pristine, original form of the faith. And so, although each of these traditions might be called a new religious movement, depending on our definition of new, they see themselves actually not as something new, but simply as a sort of more perfect exemplification of their faith. So that is what a sectarian movement typically claims to be, but in practice what actually happens is these sectarian movements develop a host of novel practices that maybe were not inherent to the faith they are supposedly perfecting, and also they typically involve a fairly strident repudiation of certain core features of the faith from which they are derived. So Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, have developed their own translation and interpretation of the Bible, which runs against much of conventional scholarship on what the Bible actually means, and this has permitted them to develop a set of novel doctrines in their faith. So most infamously, there's this doctrine that only 144,000 people, a select group, will be admitted into heaven. They also have beliefs which are a direct repudiation of previous Christian beliefs. So most prominently here, we have the rejection of the Christian notion of the Trinity. They reject certain creeds that have been central to the Christian faith for a long time, and so on. So within this Jehovah's Witness movement, we do have certain innovations and certain rejections of what came before within Christianity. Within the Hasidic sects, there is a sort of novel belief in the spiritual power of the rabbi. So there are different Hasidic communities who are centered around the belief that the rabbi at the center of their community possesses somehow some special power, some special insights, which is unusual when compared to other Jewish groups. They have developed a number of novel practices, so most distinctively are the kinds of clothing that they wear to separate themselves both from the wider society and from other Jewish groups. But there is also in Hasidic Judaism, although they see themselves as a reform movement, as a return to the purity of the original Jewish faith. But this also involves the rejection of a number of practices that have become sort of standard in Jewish practice. So Hasidic Jews tend to be skeptical of intellectual pursuits, so an intellectual approach to the study of the Torah, for example, is something to be rejected in favor of more mystical or ecstatic experiences of Scripture. There are certain liturgical patterns that they do not follow. There are certain elements of the halakha, of the Jewish law, that they might de-emphasize or pointedly not follow. So again, in Hasidic Judaism, there is this combination of innovation and rejection of certain elements of Judaism. When it comes to Salafi Islam, this is a movement which very consciously attempts to reject innovations in the faith. In fact, the Arabic term bidah, which means innovation, is basically a term of abuse in Salafi communities. To be accused of innovation is something akin to being accused of heresy or apostasy. So their belief is that they are trying to recapture the beliefs and practices of the companions of the Prophet, so going back to the very first generation of Islam, and therefore ignoring any innovations that were developed after that time. So even though they would claim that innovations in religion are a negative thing, in practice, Salafism is not just a return to what came before. Partly this is inevitable because we don't actually know an awful lot about the earliest Islamic communities. We are relying on ahadith and sources like this, which, as we've said, are pretty unreliable. So even though the Salafi imagination has it that they are returning to this pure original form of Islam, in practice that's impossible because we simply don't know exactly what the earliest forms of Islam looked like. So all of these practices and beliefs that Salafis insist on are, in a sense, a modern construction rather than a return to what came before. Salafi Muslims also tend to place a very high emphasis on so-called dawah, that is, a kind of evangelism or proselytizing program. So a lot of these media-savvy Muslims that you might have encountered on YouTube or being interviewed on television programs and so on tend to come from this Salafi school. So this is not exactly an innovation. Dawah has always existed in Islam, but the emphasis that they place on dawah as a defense and promulgation of the faith, that's relatively novel. A lot of Salafis also subscribe to a very politicized form of Islam, inspired by the writings of guys like Sayyid Qutb and so on, where it is insisted that there is no distinction to be made between religious power and secular power, that an Islamic state and Islamic law, based purely on the Quran and maybe the Ahadith, is the only way to construct a society. Again, this runs against much of the history of Islam, and certainly this sort of politicized Islam is a very modern development. So Sayyid Qutb, for example, was a 20th century author. But Salafis also reject a lot of common Islamic practices. So they reject things like the worship of saints and certain practices like this. They tend to either reject or ignore the rulings of particular legal schools. So again, there's this belief in a sort of almost more individualistic kind of Islam based purely on the original scriptures, that we don't really need all of these scholars, all of these muftis to provide rulings for us. The Sharia law is clearly there in the Quran, the Ahadith, for believers to follow. And Salafis also tend to reject more localized forms of Islam. So within the Salafi movement, there is this push for a kind of universalizing, globalizing kind of Islam, which is to be shared by Muslims all over the world. And so the particular kinds of Islam that have been developed in, let's say, North Africa or Indonesia or Bosnia, these are to be rejected as innovations. And so there's a lot of movements within these countries to promulgate a form of Islam that had never hitherto existed in these places. So Salafism, again, we see these patterns of innovation and rejection to develop a religious system which claims to be a return to the purity of the faith, to return to the original state of the faith, but which in practice actually produces something quite new and quite different. And because sects always involve this degree of innovation and rejection with respect to what came before, they often have a pretty complicated relationship to what we might term the ecclesia here, so the more generalized forms of the faith. So in the case of Hasidic Judaism and Salafi Islam, for example, I don't think that mainstream Jews or mainstream Muslims would have any problems with recognizing these movements as legitimate expressions of Judaism and Islam. So even if they don't agree with all of the beliefs and all the practices, these faiths are still recognizably within the domain of Judaism and Islam. But in other cases, these sects might claim to still be part of the original faith. In fact, as we've said, they will claim to be the purest expression of this particular faith, but the ecclesia at large will often reject these claims and castigate these sectarian movements as heretical, as existing beyond the bounds of the faith. So Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons, for example, have a pretty complicated relationship to Christianity. They will claim to be Christians, but a lot of Christians will say that actually there have been too many innovations, too many rejections of what had come before. So a lot of Christians do not see these groups as Christian. They do not believe that they are a legitimate expression of that faith. In the case of Islam, you have movements like the Ahmadiyya movement in Pakistan, which again claims to be Muslim. They believe in a messiah called Ahmad who arrived in the 19th century, and they believe that this represents the sort of culmination of Islam, so they see themselves as very much within the Islamic fold, as a continuation of what had come before, but most Muslims would reject this. They would say that these messianic beliefs are simply too far beyond the bounds of orthodox Islamic belief for this group to be counted as properly Muslim. And then there are sectarian movements which, while clearly based in some way on a pre-existing religious tradition, actually consciously attempt to separate themselves from that tradition and to claim that they are not actually just a continuation of that form of the faith. So the Baha'i faith, for example, which developed in Persia in the 19th century, when you look at the basic doctrines and the metaphysics of this faith, it's ultimately indistinguishable from Islam. There's this very strong emphasis on monotheism. There are a number of Islamic practices that have been carried over into the Baha'i faith. There is the recognition of Muhammad amongst other Islamic prophets as a legitimate prophet and so on. But at the same time, the Baha'i faith has always maintained its independence from Islam. It does not seek to be included as an Islamic sect or to be recognized by other Muslims as a legitimate expression of Islam. In the Rastafarian faith, this obviously derives from Jewish and Christian beliefs, which are retained in the Rastafarian faith, including the respect for the Bible as a legitimate source of spiritual authority, and yet most Rastafarians do not claim to be Jews or Christians. They assert that this is an independent tradition, an independent movement. So, sectarian movements always have a very complex relationship to the broader faith from which they sprang. There are dynamics of inclusion and exclusion, of group formation, which will be very important when we discuss in a moment the origins of older world faiths. But before we get to that point, we'll now focus on the second type of organizational structure that an NRM can take, and that is the cultic form. So, to reiterate, the text that I mentioned before defines a cult as, quote, loosely organized amorphous groups that offer experiential spiritual benefits such as salvation, healing, and ecstatic experiences to its adherents, end quote. So, the two features which really separate a cult from a sect, according to this definition, is firstly the more loosely organized structure of cults. So sects, because they see themselves as a return to the purity and the rigorous commitment of the original faith, often impose very strict obligations on its members in terms of the kind of things they are allowed to do, the kinds of practices they must engage in, the kind of things they must believe, and so on. And most of these sectarian movements have very clearly defined authority structures, so it's clear where the authority lies in these traditions. They often develop robust organizations with a clear hierarchy. There are clear dogmas, there are clear institutional expectations placed on believers, and so on. Whereas in a cultic movement, there of course will still be institutional expectations. There are certain things you are probably expected to believe or not believe if you are a member of the cult, but it is far more loosely defined. There is going to be a lot more heterodoxy within these movements, and they typically don't evince any sort of clear leadership structure. There typically is not a kind of centralized organization who is policing what everyone is doing and making authoritative pronouncements on what believers should and should not do. So, in practice, cultic movements tend to be rather antinomian in their stance. That is, they don't provide a strict set of rules or obligations for followers, and they therefore take on a more individualistic bent than more sectarian movements. So, you can expect that in a sectarian movement there is going to be a lot of pressure within the group for individuals to conform to the norms, to the institutions of the group, whereas in a cultic movement, that is not necessarily the case. People are sort of free to join and leave whenever they want. They can engage in their own practices. They can sort of pick and choose which elements of the movement are interesting for them, and they can pursue their faith in a more individualistic way, focused on their spiritual development, say, their physical well-being, and so on. And the second important feature of cultic movements, which that definition actually didn't make explicit, but it's this notion that cultic movements tend to be more syncretistic in their beliefs. They tend to draw on a much wider source of influences for their beliefs. And so that is a major distinction from these sectarian movements, which are self-consciously attempting to purify an existing religious tradition, whereas cultic movements are creating something new by drawing on influences from a much broader range of sources. So examples of cultic movements might be things like the New Age movement, the Theosophical movement, various forms of neo-paganism, including Wicca. We can also point to many of these forms of spirituality which have been influenced by so-called Eastern traditions, which draw a lot on traditions like Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and so on, but in a very, again, syncretistic way, drawing particular elements from particular of these faiths. And so a lot of the guru movements in India, a lot of the Western expressions of Eastern spirituality would fall into this category as well. Then we have sort of more infamous or controversial religious movements, things like the Heaven's Gate cult or the Raelian movement or Scientology, which again have a number of innovative features. They do not see themselves as a continuation of what came before. But if you study these faiths in depth, you see that there are a number of ideas that are actually not genuine innovations, that have actually been borrowed from other sources. So something like the Heaven's Gate cult, for example, it would reject the Christian label, it would reject the label that it is a UFO religion. So this is a group which, if you're not familiar with it, they famously believed that there was a spaceship that was trailing the Hale-Bopp comet, and that if they killed themselves, their souls would be lifted up to the comet, and they would go on to live immortal lives in this spaceship. So this seems like, a pretty unique and innovative religious tradition. But when you look at it in a bit more detail, there are a number of themes here related to soteriology, salvation, the existence of a soul, the nature of immortality, the nature of heaven even, which have obviously influenced these kind of beliefs. And there's also a pretty strong influence from the broader cultural beliefs that exist about UFOs and about the special, borderline supernatural nature of alien civilizations. So even for something like the Heaven's Gate cult, which doesn't seem to be preceded by anything before it, it seems to be a genuine innovation in the religious context, even then it is still drawing from pre-existing sources. It's a sort of syncretistic melange of what had come before. And this is an important observation because it shows us that whether an NRM takes the form of a sect or of a cult, that really there is never anything new in religion, that every religious tradition, even these new ones which seem very unique and very special, when you get down to it, are really just rehashing, remixing certain ideas that have a much longer history in the world. So if an NRM is a sectarian movement, so it's sort of a splinter group from a much wider religious tradition, then obviously the kind of variety in doctrines and practices in these movements is going to be very limited. I mean, most of these traditions will, in fact, try to reject the idea that they involve anything innovative. They are very self-consciously going to try to appeal to already established beliefs and practices in the development of their group. So there's obviously not going to be a lot of innovation in any sectarian movement, although, as we've said, some degree of innovation is basically unavoidable. And even if we look at cultic movements, which do seem to be a lot more ideologically diffuse, there seems to be a lot of variety in the kind of forms that they take, and there seems to be something a little bit special, even crazy, about some of the things that these cultic movements are proclaiming. But as I've said, if you dig a little bit deeper, you're going to find very common themes in a lot of these cultic movements. They are very often going to make appeals to existing religious concepts, things like karma, dharma, reincarnation, chakras, particular gods, particular spirits, things like this. They are going to include a number of practices that also pre-exist the tradition, things like prayer, meditation, particular mantras, particular chants. These are also going to be borrowed from pre-existing religious traditions. Or alternatively, they will make appeal to very vague, very diffuse spiritual notions. So things like the divine spirit, the universal consciousness, energies. These are words which also crop up very often in cultic movements because they are a very domain general kind of concept. They can be invoked in a wide variety of circumstances. They don't have a dogmatic, precise definition. So these sorts of concepts also crop up time and time again in cultic movements. But again, there's nothing particularly new here. All cultic movements, just like sectarian movements, tend to be very influenced by the particular historical circumstances in which they're developed. And so when you look at any NRM, and you ask yourself why they have come to these particular beliefs, your first step should be to look at the surrounding culture, what people around them believe, what their culture has taught them about the nature of the world, and what you will typically find is that cultic movements are a reflection of the historical situation in which they are birthed. So this is a very important idea, which we will see as we examine the development of older religious traditions, but basically there are materialistic historical forces which guide the development of particular ideas and which guide which particular ideas are to be taken as credible at any given time. And it is this more than anything else which explains the development of new religious movements, which explains why they arrive at the kinds of beliefs and practices that they do. So if this is obvious in the case of new religious movements, I argue it's also pretty obvious in the case of the development of these older traditions as well. So when we look at the histories of these major world religious traditions, we're going to find that there are various sectarian movements and cultic movements which have contributed to the development of these religions, and all of these religions are ultimately a reflection of and a reaction to the religious and social milieu in which they developed. And by examining this milieu, I think that we can go a long way to explaining how and why it is that these religious traditions developed. So we can start with the history of Judaism, for example. So according to the Bible and according to contemporary Jewish theology, the origins of Judaism are based in a covenant between Yahweh and the people of Israel. So they would attempt to argue that the origins of the faith rest in a particular miraculous event. It was something new, it was a revelation from God. It created, by virtue of that, a new religion that had a clear separation from what came before it and from what surrounded it. So Endemic theories about the origins of the Jewish faith will, of course, reject materialistic explanations, which see Judaism as a kind of continuation of or reaction to the religious systems that preceded it. But if we study the history of Judaism, it's actually not very difficult to find where these continuations exist. So, firstly, there are sectarian elements to the development of the Jewish faith. So, there had probably always been the worship of Yahweh at the central temple in Jerusalem, but that was not necessarily the normative form of religious practice all around Israel. I won't go into a lot of detail about this here. If you're interested in this topic, please check out my episode on the reign of King Josiah, which will go into this in much more detail. But basically, the religious landscape at the time of around the 7th century BCE, when a lot of the biblical texts were first penned, was actually a very diverse religious landscape, which was heavily influenced by the religious milieu of Israel and Judah at that time. So a lot of the beliefs and practices of people in that region in the 7th century BCE were really just versions of Canaanite religion or other ancient Near Eastern religions. People in Israel and Judah, as the Bible tells us, were still worshipping other Semitic gods like Baal and others like this. So it was a very fractured religious landscape, but there was definitely a cult of Yahweh which existed in Jerusalem, and what they attempted to do in the 7th century BCE under the reign of King Josiah, and later on in the post-exilic period, so the end of the 6th century BCE into the 5th century BCE, was to impose this Yahwistic cult as the primary, indeed only form of worship to be permitted in the territory of Judah. And the rhetoric of these religious reformers, as it is preserved in the Bible, is incredibly clear. They argued that this was not a religious innovation. They argued that this was a return to the pristine form of the Hebrew faith, which actually involved the monolatrous worship of Yahweh. And so a lot of the biblical myths which depict God's relationship to various prophets and which depict God as punishing Israel and Judah for offering him his due fealty, these are rhetorical devices which argue that the religion of the Yahwistic cult, which was being imposed on the region, was actually a return to a purer, more pristine form of Judahite religion. So in this sense, we can consider Judaism at these initial stages to be a kind of sectarian movement because it did preserve a lot of the theology and a lot of the beliefs and practices which preceded it, but which also strove to impose a strict, what they would see as a more pure form of religious practice. And there are various reasons why these reformers might have been motivated to do this, so as I argue in the episode on King Josiah, we should definitely be looking at the desire of these reformers to centralize political and religious power in Jerusalem, and so, of course, to provide these monolatrous Yahwists with a degree of political and religious control in the country. But the fact is that we don't need to be looking at any sort of special divine intervention or any sort of miraculous origin for Judaism, because the material facts, I think, are pretty clear. There is a clear desire in the rhetoric of the Bible to impose what is in practice actually a kind of novel religious system, but it is couched as a continuation of a return to what had come before. But there are also aspects of the origins of Judaism which share more in common with cultic movements as opposed to sectarian movements. So critically here, there is a kind of syncretism in the development of this biblical theology. So, most obviously, we have things like the titles applied to Yahweh, such as El and Elohim. These are derived from the Canaanite religious tradition, so there seems to be a fairly self-conscious attempt to conflate Yahweh with these venerable older religious traditions that circulated in Canaan. So by identifying Yahweh as El, they can draw on the venerable authority of Canaanite religious practices in order to buttress their own particular religion. If Yahweh is El, then really the Canaanites have just been worshipping this god all along. Then there are particular practices which also seem to have been drawn from the broader milieu. So things like circumcision, for example, this was a common Semitic practice even before the emergence of Israel and Judah. The worship of a single god in a central temple in the capital city, and adopting that god as a kind of patron warrior god. This is also a very common trope in ancient Near Eastern religious traditions. And even a lot of the literature on which Judaism is based, so many of the myths in the Torah and other Old Testament literature, these have many direct parallels in older Near Eastern cultures. The development of wisdom literature later on, this was also something that was borrowed from neighboring cultures. So, importantly, Judaism was never this sort of pure, pristine faith that had a clear degree of separation from what surrounded it. Rather, it was really a continuation of the Canaanite and other Near Eastern religious traditions that only later adopted a self-conscious, independent identity which asserted the existence of Yahweh alone. But this only occurred after hundreds of years of religious development, during which the nature of the faith was clearly influenced by what had preceded it and by what existed around it. The origins of Buddhism are a little bit murkier, so as I said before, the sources we have about the origins of Buddhism are very late historically, and they are obviously clouded by a number of mythological constructions. But at the same time, I think we know enough about the nature of Buddhism to see it as a pretty clear sectarian movement in the context of the Indian religions in which it developed. So obviously inherent to Buddhism are a number of key concepts that were borrowed from the Indian religion in which it developed. So things like karma, dharma, reincarnation, Maya, Mara, a lot of these originate in Hinduism. Various central Buddhist practices, such as meditation or a focus on asceticism, these also have their origins in the broader Indian religious tradition in which Buddhism was developed. So, as with the sectarian movements we can observe amongst NRMs, there is a very clear continuation with what came before it. It's difficult to know, but probably Buddha did not see himself as starting some novel faith. Rather, what he would have seen himself as is the kind of charismatic leader which was seeking to purify the Indian religious traditions in which he was ensconced. And we can see this particularly in the way that the Buddha addressed metaphysical questions. So there's a constant theme throughout his sayings that we shouldn't invest too much time or energy into exploring metaphysical questions, that these are, in a sense, a distraction or potentially unknowable anyway. And this is particularly clear, I think, in the development of the distinctly Buddhist doctrine of anatta. So this is sometimes translated as the doctrine of the no-self, but that's a little bit of an oversimplification, I think. So to be clear, the Buddhist didn't deny the existence of a self. In fact, there's an entire chapter in the Dhammapada devoted to the nature of the self. So what the Buddha actually believed was that the self was actually a conglomeration of different features, that it was temporary, that it was contingent, that it was ephemeral, But that's not the same as saying that there is no such thing as a self at all. But what the Anatta specifically was a repudiation of the Hindu doctrine of Atman. So in Hindu philosophy, in Hindu religion at the time, there was this concept of Atman, which different schools conceived in different ways. So broadly, there were the Dvaita and the Advaita Vedanta schools of Hinduism. The former believed that there were two distinct essences in the world, Atman, which corresponds to something like soul or consciousness or life force, something along those lines, and Brahman, who is sort of like the ultimate cosmic principle of the universe, the foundational consciousness of all that there is. And in Dvaita Vedanta, the idea is that these two substances are separate. In Advaita Vedanta, the idea is that these two substances are, well, consubstantial, that they are the same thing, that we are all one, really. But Buddha's point was that there actually is no such thing in the world which corresponds to this timeless, permanent essence like Atman, and that in fact pursuing Atman, speculating on the nature of Atman, worrying about the ultimate destination of one's Atman was a distraction from what should be your ultimate religious and spiritual goals. So Buddha here developed the doctrine of Anatta, and of course there is a philosophical basis for this. He didn't just come up with this for no reason, but importantly, when we examine the development of Buddhism and its eventual separation from Hindu strains of thought, this was one very big emphasis of the Buddha's philosophy, which distinguished it from the Indian philosophy which surrounded him, and that was a repudiation of the existence of a stable, unchanging, timeless self. And while, of course, it's very difficult to know what was going through the Buddha's mind when he developed this idea, without better historical records, we are sort of confined to speculation here. But I can certainly imagine that this particular doctrine was developed because the Buddha saw it as a kind of obstacle towards enlightenment or spiritual development. That if people were too focused on these metaphysical issues and issues of salvation and the afterlife, then that was going to be something of an obstacle to their spiritual development. So, in purifying the faith, as he saw it, his goal was going to be to remove some of these metaphysical excesses of the surrounding Indian religious traditions and to try to develop Buddhism as a kind of purer expression of spiritual development, that Buddhism was going to focus on different things, the things that really matter, as opposed to all of these metaphysical accretions that had built up in the Indian religious traditions. And I think there's a similar logic behind the Buddhist rejection of the Vedic literature as a source of authority. So, if there is anything today which definitively separates schools of Indian thought like Buddhism and Jainism from what we today call Hinduism, it's the fact that the Buddhists and the Jains reject the Vedic literature. And the Vedic literature is a very big corpus of literature. There is a lot of material in there, but central to this Vedic literature is the idea that there are certain gods who exist in the world and who are active in the world, and the Vedic literature is basically a manual on how it is we are to approach and interact with these gods in order to achieve certain blessings, in order to achieve salvation, a more propitious afterlife, and so on. And the Vedic literature proposes very specifically defined rituals that we ought to perform in order to properly ingratiate ourselves to these gods, and particularly the Vedic literature places responsibility for the discharge of these rituals in the hands of a very special priestly caste referred to as the Brahmins. So in the Vedic imagination, there are very immanent gods with very immanent powers who we can sort of manipulate through ritual into getting what we want, and that ultimately it's by placing our trust in these Brahminical priests who understand the rituals, who are, well, frankly, the only ones in the community capable of reading this literature, and through placing our trust in these priestly mediators, we are going to get certain divine blessings from the gods. So, in establishing itself as a kind of sectarian movement, as a purification of Indian religion, Buddhism basically set itself against each of these three major premises. So, first of all, Buddhism doesn't deny the existence of gods. There are certainly gods which exist in the Buddhist cosmology, but critically, in the Buddhist imagination, these gods are still subordinate to the forces of Dharma and Karma, so they are superior to human beings, but they are not so transcendent as all that. They are just beings who are stuck in the cycle of samsara, much the same as the rest of us, and so we shouldn't necessarily expect the gods to be any particular help to us on our religious quest. So if the goal is to escape this cycle of samsara, if the goal of religion is to reduce or avoid entirely the problem of suffering, then merely appealing to the gods is not going to be sufficient. We need a different, a purer path towards our spiritual betterment, and only through this particular path can we escape the wheel of samsara, can we escape the problem of suffering. So the gods are there then, but they can't really save us, and so if the gods lose this kind of soteriological power, or really any power to intervene to solve these deep problems of existence, then it also implies that the rituals that we perform in order to placate these gods, in order to encourage these gods to intervene at our behest, these rituals are also going to be ineffective. So Buddhism is going to reject the efficacy of these Brahminical rituals, and certainly Buddhism has developed its own rituals, its own practices, so Buddhism is not a repudiation of ritual and religious practice altogether, but it is a rejection of these Brahminical practices which believe that the ultimate goal of religious practice is to change the will of the gods, whereas Buddhism will see the goal of religious practice is to improve oneself and really to save oneself rather than to expect the gods to save us on our behalf. And thirdly, so if the gods cannot really help us, if these religious rituals are ineffective, then there really isn't a role for these Brahminical priests to play either. So in the Vedic literature, it is of course the priests who are placed at the top of the social hierarchy. In the caste system, it is the Brahmins who sit atop everyone else. But if in the Buddhist imagination these Brahmins don't really wield any particular power, the gods that they are appealing to are feckless, the religious rituals they perform are completely ineffective, so why should it be then that they place themselves at the top of society? Why should it be that religious practice revolves around these men? Well, the Buddhist answer to these questions is that really the Brahmins don't deserve to be at the top of this hierarchy, and indeed the Buddhist imagination says that we don't need this hierarchy at all. So Buddhism very early on did away with the caste system, the idea that some people are intrinsically superior to others in society, that everyone in society has a particular role on this hierarchy and that this role cannot be challenged. So Buddhism instead promotes a more individualistic conception of religion, that basically anyone is capable of achieving enlightenment, of solving for themselves the problems of escaping samsara and escaping suffering. So although, of course, Buddhism has developed its own class of religious specialists, its own class of monks and holy men and bodhisattvas and so on, there is still in Buddhism this idea that you don't necessarily need any of these people, that your spiritual development is in your own hands, and therefore Buddhism can be viewed as a rejection of this Brahminical concept of religious specialists being necessary for the pursuit of religious goals. But Buddhism also shares some commonalities with cultic NRMs in the sense that it didn't really seem to develop a strong centralized authority early on in its history, and there seemed to be a number of different practices, a number of different beliefs that were tolerated within the early Buddhist Sangha. So to be clear, from the very first days of Buddhism, the faith did have a strong monastic focus, and if you want to be a monk, then there are typically very clear, very strict rules you have to follow. But the point is that Buddhism seemed to develop a number of different monastic communities governed by different monastic rules. Buddhist tradition tells us that within the first couple of hundred years of Buddhism that there were already 18 competing schools in existence. And while there were Buddhist councils which were designed to try to arrive at a universal sort of dogma, a universal set of beliefs for the faith, these were never particularly successful, and so Buddhism from its earliest days has always tolerated a degree of plurality. There has always been the sense within the faith that the goal is not to strictly follow rules, but rather to pursue in a sort of individualistic sense your own spiritual betterment, and again, that is a hallmark of cultic NRMs. Now, it's difficult to know how much of this can actually be attributed to Buddha, whether this is really the kind of vision that he had for his religious movement, or whether it was just a sort of accident of history that Buddhism happened to develop in that way. So, as I've said, when it comes to the deeds and the sayings of Buddha, there is not a lot of reliable information that we have. A lot of the sayings attributed to Buddha are very late, and sort of each Buddhist school has its own particular canon of the sayings of the Buddha. Each particular language group within Buddhism tends to have its own corpus of texts attributed to the Buddha. So we don't know exactly what the Buddha believed, but it seems reasonable to believe that he was preaching exactly this sort of message, that the focus should be on individualistic spiritual development, that simply following rituals or accepting particular kinds of beliefs or praying to the right gods, these were not going to work. You had to pursue in a more rigorous and individualistic way your own spiritual development. And if that indeed was the message at the heart of Buddhism from the very beginning, then it's no surprise that Buddhism has developed in the way that it has, where it is a religious faith with very few central dogmas, with very few mandated practices, and with a strong individualistic focus, typically. Christianity, though, is probably an even clearer example of a sectarian religious movement. So Jesus was self-evidently within the Jewish faith. He considered himself to be Jewish, and what he preached was not an overturning of Judaism or a repudiation of Judaism, but he was actually calling for a purer form of the faith, which was wedded to particular eschatological ideas that were circulating within Jewish communities at the time. So Jesus' message at base reiterates what John the Baptist had been preaching, that the time of the kingdom of God was nigh, and that if you wanted to be accepted into this kingdom, then you really needed to be religiously pure. You needed to be repentant, you needed to live in a state of sort of moral purity and perfection, and that this was the only way to be saved. And so Jesus obviously believed very strongly in Jewish practices, in Jewish beliefs, but his argument was that the way that these beliefs and practices were being expressed in the culture of his time were insufficient, that they were insufficiently pure. So the biblical text, for example, shows him repudiating the practices of the Pharisees, who were a very strictly legalistic group, and Jesus is depicted as arguing that merely following the injunctions of the law, or even worse, just pretending to follow the injunctions of the law, was not going to be sufficient. And while a lot of Christians are inclined to find a sort of antinomian streak in this, so the idea that Jesus was repudiating the law, I find that very dubious. I mean, there are biblical passages, such as in the Gospel of Matthew, which suggest that Jesus said he did not come to abolish the law but to fulfill it, although I think that passage is probably a Matthean insertion. These were probably not the original words of Jesus. But even beyond that, there is no evidence in the biblical text to suggest that Jesus believed that the law was a bad idea. In fact, he was arguing, it seems to me, for an even stricter application of the law. But this did not just involve mindlessly following particular injunctions, but following the spirit of the law as well, and using this to develop people into a state of spiritual and ethical perfection, which would grant them benefits on the day that the kingdom of God finally arrived. So again, in this sense, the mission of Jesus shares a very similar rhetoric to the rhetoric of sectarian new religious movements. So there is an embracing of what came before, the belief that what he was doing was merely a continuation or a perfection of Jewish traditions, while also introducing certain innovations, rejecting certain practices that had accreted into the faith before him. So the rhetoric, the dynamic here of the mission of Jesus and the very earliest times of Christianity mirror, I think, very closely the dynamics of sectarian new religious movements. But we can also identify features that are endemic to cultic movements as well here. So I don't think that Jesus was incorporating any sort of syncretistic beliefs into his message. It does seem pretty straightforwardly Jewish in intent. But in the earliest few decades of Christianity, the faith very quickly spread to Gentile churches, who brought certain idiosyncratic beliefs into the Christian faith based on the sort of cultural milieu, the philosophical and theological milieu in which they grew up. And so we know from the writings of Paul, amongst others in the New Testament, that there was a lot of variety in the practices and beliefs of the early Christians. So Paul himself talks about broadly a division between the Gentile proselytizers, which he represented, and the so-called School of Jerusalem, headed by Peter and James, which were advocating more for a mission towards the Jews as opposed to the Gentiles. But as these Gentile churches developed, they started bringing in particular Greek beliefs, so things like the soul or the idea of a spiritual resurrection as opposed to the bodily resurrection of Judaism. These crept into Christianity pretty early. Things like the development of a Christology, which saw Jesus as an exalted, deified figure. This also probably borrows very heavily from Gentile as opposed to Jewish beliefs. And we also know from Paul's writings that the early structure of Christian communities was very diffuse. Paul does occasionally make mention to particular leaders of communities or people who do seem to be in a high position in those communities, but otherwise the early Christian communities were fairly diffuse in terms of their leadership. There was a big emphasis placed, at least in these Pauline churches, on charismatic authority, so things like prophesying, speaking in tongues. These were a better signal of one's spiritual authority, as opposed to formal or hierarchical leadership structures that were imposed on the communities from without. So, in this sense, early Christianity shares a lot with cultic movements, in that the beliefs of the early churches seem to have been very diffuse. There seems to have been a lot of freedom to sort of pick and choose what you wanted to believe. So that is why different Christian communities produced different kinds of gospels, different kinds of letters that have distinct theologies within them. And so these early Gentile Christian churches had more in common, I think, with so-called cultic NRMs as opposed to sectarian NRMs. There was a big focus here on individualistic spiritual development, which, as we've said, is the primary focus of cultic movements, as opposed to sectarian movements which see themselves as a purification of an existing faith. The Gentiles, who were not Jewish, obviously, would not have seen themselves as purifying the Jewish faith, though that was certainly part of their rhetoric as well, but rather they saw themselves as forming a diffuse charismatic community based on the fruits of the Spirit, as opposed to some established religious authority. The origins of Islam also have a fairly clear sectarian nature, so we see this in the rhetoric of the Quran, for example, where it attempts to portray this revelation and the prophethood of Muhammad not as a religious innovation, but simply as a return to a pure kind of monotheism that had previously existed and that had previously been propounded by the various prophets that are recognized by Islam, so people like Jesus, Moses, Abraham, and so on. And so the Quran, therefore, presents itself as a kind of call to a purification of this monotheistic faith that Judaism and Christianity had somehow corrupted this pure form of the faith, and therefore that Islam is not an innovation, it's not a call to something new, it is a call for a return to a purer, more pristine form of faith. But Islam also obviously drew, I think, very self-consciously from the theology and the mythology of Judaism and Christianity, and therefore, like other sectarian movements that we can see among NRMs today, Islam always had a sort of complex relationship to these two faiths. So the Quran is actually a little bit ambiguous sometimes about the status of Jews and Christians and about the legitimacy of Jewish and Christian practice. So interestingly, the Quran doesn't actually use the term Muslim very much to refer to members of this religious movement. Rather, it uses the Arabic term mumin, which means something like believer. And so there is actually some debate amongst scholars about who exactly was to be included in this community, so what it meant to be a believer, and whether it could include Jews, Christians, and other monotheistic groups in the Arabian Peninsula, or if, rather, there was only one legitimate expression of monotheism, namely the kind of monotheism expressed in the Quran. So the Quran also makes reference to people of the book, that's the phrase that it uses, and at times it seems to include these people of the book, so that would include Jews and Christians, as part of the community, but other parts of the Quran offer some fairly strident rebukes of particular elements of Jewish and Christian doctrine and practice. So, as I said, the Quran is a little bit ambiguous in this sense, and there's a lot of debates about what the earliest Islamic communities might have looked like, whether they permitted a degree of heterodoxy, so long as Jews and Christians accepted the charismatic leadership of Muhammad. Were they therefore protected? Were they allowed to continue in their practices in this new community? Or were they from a very early stage targeted and required to conform with the demands of this faith? But whatever the case is, it's pretty clear that very early on in Islamic history, so certainly by the time that the first caliphs arrived on the scene, there was the belief that Islam was not just an extension of Judaism and Christianity. It really did represent its own unique faith, even though, of course, the rhetoric that Islam was the original form of monotheism would continue to be reiterated. But by the time we have the Caliph Uthman, there was clearly a very strong push for religious centralization in the Islamic world. So this is probably about 30 years after the death of Muhammad, where there was a lot of political and religious power centralized on the office of the caliphate, and Islam at this stage is obviously its own independent religious tradition, which considered itself to be both separate from and superior to these religious traditions from which it sprang. And while I don't think we could ever properly say that Islam was ever a cultic movement in the sense we defined it before, so here this was a strictly nomian religion with very clear expectations placed on believers. There wasn't a lot of tolerance for heterodoxy or for individualistic spiritual pursuits. From the very first moment, Islam was self-consciously designed as a sort of centralizing religious program. But at the same time, it does share some features with cultic movements in the sense that it has clearly adopted and retooled certain concepts from different religious traditions in the Arabian Peninsula. So certain beliefs, for example, the belief in Allah, that was something which predated Islam in the Arabian Peninsula. Belief in spiritual beings like jinn, these are also pre-Islamic beliefs. Many of the titles and properties ascribed to God in the Quran are deliberate echoes of titles that were applied to Arabian gods in polytheistic Arabian traditions. Many of the practices endemic to Islam as well were taken from other Arabian traditions, so things like pilgrimage, that was already an established Arabian religious tradition. Things like aniconism, the rejection of idols, these were also features of pre-Islamic Arabian religion. And so once more, there is not a lot of genuine innovation in the development of Islam. It presents itself very deliberately as a kind of sectarian movement, as a purification of the monotheistic faiths, but at the same time, it does also have a degree of syncretism, like every other religion, in which certain concepts that were endemic to the region at the time were borrowed by the earliest Islamic community. They are presented in the Quranic text, but of course they are co-opted and given their own particular meaning, their own particular spin within an Islamic context. And finally, we can briefly look at the Chinese religions and how they developed. So the Chinese religions are an interesting example of religiosity. It feels like almost any time you feel like you have a coherent theory of religion, it always seems to run aground on the Chinese religions because they did develop in a sort of very special context. They have their own particular dynamics. They have sort of evolved in tandem together, and so they don't neatly fit the pattern sometimes that we see in other religious traditions. But even here, it's pretty easy to see various sectarian and cultic influences on the development of these traditions. So Chinese religion is typically connected with the three major faiths, Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. But To be clear, there's always sort of been a distinction in China between what we might call popular Chinese religion and these more formal official forms of the faith. So when we talk about Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, we're not really talking about popular religious movements that were spread amongst the population. But rather we are talking about beliefs and practices that were held by a relatively small and elite segment of the population a lot of the time. So certainly ordinary people did follow certain Buddhist practices, certain Taoist practices, certain Confucian practices at different times in history, to different extents, but there was never really a stage in Chinese history where a particular religious tradition was imposed on Chinese people. A lot of the popular Chinese religion involves the worship of gods, various superstitious beliefs about the manipulation of spirits, about various magical practices, and so on, which are not necessarily part of any of the official traditions of these three major faiths. So if we look at the development of Chinese religion at the broadest, most popular level, then it clearly shares a lot in common with cultic movements in the sense that the beliefs of popular Chinese religion have always been heavily syncretistic. They are happy to draw on various religious traditions, including Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, where appropriate, but also there has been sort of indigenous Chinese religious spirit as well, which informed a lot of these beliefs. Chinese religion, at the popular level, never really developed strong centralizing authorities. Individual villages would sort of have their own practices, which were maybe communally policed. Maybe there were still expectations on members of that village to engage in certain practices, but there was certainly never a centralizing authority with respect to Chinese popular religion. There has never been an accepted set of dogmas. There has never been an official version of this religion. It's always been developed in quite an ad hoc way, where people engage in particular beliefs, in particular practices, as I've said, in a sort of ad hoc way, picking and choosing what is most appropriate to them, what they believe will help them most. And so a parallel for popular Chinese religion amongst NRMs would be something like the New Age movement. So the New Age movement, as we know, represents a sort of diffuse set of beliefs and practices. There are a number of beliefs common to a number of people involved in the New Age movement, but the New Age movement has never really coalesced into a coherent body of ideas or practices. Part of the attraction of the New Age movement is the ability of individuals to pick and choose the particular elements of the faith that they find most useful, most helpful. And we find basically the same situation in the history of popular Chinese religion. But when it comes to the three major faiths, as I've said, when we are tracing their trajectories, we are really tracing the ideas of a particularly elite minority of the population. And so a lot of their ideas and practices didn't necessarily filter through to the average person in China. And one big reason for this was the fact that none of these three religions were ever really able to achieve a degree of political hegemony in the region. So all three of them have at times had very close relationships with the emperor. Various emperors have been very attached to one of these particular traditions above the other two, but it's never happened for long enough or in a deep enough, pervasive enough way for any religious tradition in China to really wed itself to political power and therefore to exert its hegemony over society. So the easiest way for a religious tradition to spread throughout society is for it to wed itself to political power and then to insist on its own exclusivity, that it should be practiced to the exclusion of all others. But Chinese religions have never had that kind of impetus. They've never achieved any sort of political hegemony, at least for any length of time. And none of them are exclusivistic in the sense that there is a particular central set of dogmas or practices which members of these traditions believe are to be followed to the exclusion of all else. So when we trace the history of the three Chinese traditions, there has been a lot of syncretistic overlap between them. When you read a lot of the major scholars of these traditions, there has been a lot of borrowing and overlap in the language and concepts that are used. So a term like Dao, for example, is central to all three of the Chinese faiths, even though they put a different gloss or spin on the meaning of that word. But it does result in a sort of syncretistic form of religion. And although all three of these traditions have been able to develop some sort of central authority, so the priestly caste in Taoism, the monastic caste in Buddhism, and the scholarly caste in Confucianism, each of these central authorities have also evinced a lot of plurality in their thinking. There have been a number of different what we would call schools as opposed to sects in each of these religious traditions, but really a school is a kind of sect. Each school is preaching a different form of the faith, what they would see as the best exemplification of the faith. So all three of the major religious traditions in China have had this degree of heterodoxy and plurality, but I'm not sure it has really ever evolved to the state of pure sectarianism. There has been a lot of tolerance for different ideas. So again, in this sense, even formal Chinese religion shares more in common with cultic NRMs rather than sectarian NRMs. So we can see that there are a lot of similarities between NRMs and these older religious traditions in terms of the how of their development, but I think there's also a lot of similarities in the why of their development. So here we can ask ourselves the question, why is it that if we already have some established religions and established religious practices, why would anyone actually be motivated to develop a new religion, particularly when that new religion really is just going to involve a rehashing of old ideas and practices? And why would people be motivated to join these movements? So again, we can study NRMs and try to understand why it is that they are developed, under what conditions are they most likely to be developed, and how is it that they actually attract people to join the movement? So one fairly consistent finding in the study of the sociology of NRMs is that they tend to be more successful during periods in which the perceived legitimacy of established authorities starts to be eroded. Now, that's a pretty vague phrase. What does it mean when the legitimacy of traditional authorities are eroded? Well, there are many different forms that this can take. So, for example, NRMs have traditionally flourished during periods of great social dislocation in the West. So things like the Industrial Revolution, the increasing speed of urbanization in Western societies, and even during the counterculture of the 1960s, all of these periods have been correlated with a growth in new religious movements, typically Christian movements, of course, particularly in the earlier two examples. But during the 1960s, of course, there was a genuine flourishing of new religious movements as part of the 1960s counterculture. Then it can be things like just general changes in the sort of conceptual horizon of a society. So, for example, as the West has become more and more influenced by science, that has opened the door for various NRMs with a sort of pseudo-scientific focus to get their foot in. So things like Scientology in particular, or these various UFO religions, which are predicated on the idea that there exist these advanced civilizations with godlike powers. These are only really made possible because of the shift in thinking in the West, where science occupies a privileged epistemic status, and even something like the spread of Buddhism in the West can be attributed to this, because it's often claimed by Western Buddhists that Buddhism doesn't have the same excessive metaphysics as other religions, so you can be a Buddhist without believing in any particular gods or ghosts or spirits or anything like that. And a lot of the apologetics for Buddhism in the West contains references to things like neuroscience, the scientific benefits of Buddhism. So that's another example of how a shift in the way that a society thinks opens the door for different new religious movements. NRMs will also, of course, tend to flourish when established religious authorities begin to lose their legitimacy. So we can see this a little bit in the West. So, of course, there have been endless scandals implicating the Catholic Church amongst other Christian denominations. There has been a kind of reaction to the staid, moderate and unadventurous forms of Christianity offered by mainline Christian denominations. And so that's opened the space for a number of charismatic Christian movements, particularly evangelism and the Pentecostal movement and movements like this, which have witnessed extraordinary growth, even at a time where Christianity itself, in general, is on the wane. So, in general, if we want to understand why it is that the established religious traditions were able to achieve some early success in their development, we're going to be looking to these kinds of social conditions. So what kind of authorities existed in those times, and how did the development of these religious traditions solve the problem of an erosion in the legitimacy of these traditional authorities? So, in the case of Judaism and Islam, what we can see is that they developed during a period in which religious authority was really fragmented, and both of these religious traditions represent a kind of movement to centralize and unify religious authority in that territory. So Judaism, as we've already discussed in our episode on King Josiah, began in a period of religious fragmentation where there were many different religious cults in operation, many different centers of religious worship. And basically, their solution was to use violence to destroy all of these competing forms of religious authority, and so ideally to leave just a single central religious authority closely linked to the king and his court in Jerusalem to replace this more fragmented religious system. And the case of Islam is pretty similar, where there was a very strong tribalistic element to Arabian society, where different towns, different cities, different tribes had their own sort of authority structures, they had their own way of doing religion, and so on. And so Muhammad's program from the beginning was basically, again, one of political centralization. So to take all of these fragmented political authorities, to make appeals to them, so to try to identify what was common between all these traditions, and to offer a religious program which was likely to be appealing to them. It appealed to certain concepts like Allah and pilgrimage and so on that were already existent in the territory at the time, but what it promised was a unified religious program that would solve the problem of authority. It would solve the problem of all this political division by basically placing political and religious power in the hands of the early Islamic community. And if Islamic sources are to be trusted on this, and actually scholars seem to believe that they are, To a large extent, the early Muslim community was actually welcome to this end, so they were specifically invited to Medina in order to solve some of these tribal disputes that were occurring. So Muhammad was the right man at the right place at the right time. He offered a political and religious program which promised the unification that so many people on the Arabian Peninsula apparently wanted, and so again, that solved the crisis of authority that existed in that time at that place. In the case of Christianity, this movement arose during a period of crisis for Jewish authority. So the main problem was that the self-appointed leaders of the Jewish community in Judea at the time, so these are called the Sadducees, they had very little popular support. They were seen as collaborators with the Romans. The beliefs of the Sadducees differed from the popular beliefs of Jewish people at the time. So there was a very big disconnect between official Jewish authorities and the ordinary people. There were movements like the Pharisaic movement, who enjoyed a lot of popular support, but there was also a lot of resistance towards them because, as we've said, of their legalistic focus. They were seen as hypocrites. They would have been seen as sort of the first century Judean equivalent of Wowsers or Puritans, something like that. So the message of Jesus and other charismatic figures at the time in the Jewish faith, Jesus was certainly not the first or last of these charismatic figures, but he promised a kind of revitalization of the Jewish faith. He offered people in Judea the promise of a much more spiritually rich and committed form of the faith. And actually his mission doesn't seem to have been terribly successful with the Jewish people, the people to which he was originally speaking, but his ideas did seem to take more root within Gentile communities later on, and so Christianity became a very sort of charismatic, cultic movement, as we've said, particularly in the early years before formal religious authorities were developed in the 2nd century. But even here, much of the attraction to the early Gentile converts of Christianity must have been this promise of unity, the promise of the establishment of a transcendent religious and political authority, which again was tied up with certain eschatological beliefs, so the belief that this religious and political authority would actually be implemented by God at some point in the near future. But pretty quickly, so within 300 years of the death of Jesus, Christianity had become a state religion in the Roman Empire, and again it was successful to this end because it promised a form of authority, a form of unity, which the fractured pagan religious traditions of the Hellenistic and Roman world weren't able to promise. In more modern times, we can see certain religious traditions that have been developed as a reaction to the problem of religious authority that has been created by religious conflicts. So Sikhism, for example, developed in a part of the world where there was a lot of division between Hindu and Islamic religious authorities and Hindu and Islamic political powers. And so although I'm sure Sikhs don't like to think of their religion in this way, what it basically offers is a kind of theological religious compromise between Hinduism and Islam. It takes various elements of both, what it sees as the best elements of both, and attempts to rework them into a novel religious tradition that would theoretically offer a degree of unity to the Punjab region, though as subsequent history has proven, it wasn't exactly successful to that end. And then we have the Baha'i faith, developed in the 19th century, so this would actually be more of an NRM than an established religious tradition, I think. But here, the Baha'i faith was developed by Baha'u'llah, very self-consciously, I think, as a way of providing religious unity on a more global scale. So the Baha'i scriptures show a lot of respect for all of the world's religious traditions. They show a lot of respect for the various prophets and figureheads of these different religions, suggesting that they had all had a point, that they all got certain things right. But the Baha'i faith sets itself up as a unifying religious tradition. In fact, if there is any single word which we could use to define the Baha'i religion, it would be unity. So this is a religious tradition that developed in a more globalized era of world history, and it sets itself out very self-consciously as a solution to the crisis of religious authority brought about in a globalized world by all of these different religious traditions now living in close proximity to one another and not being able to agree on very much at all. So the Baha'i faith positions itself not just as a solution to a crisis in religious authority in a particular territory, but as a general global solution to the problem of the crisis of religious authority which exists all over the world. And finally, in the case of Buddhism, as we've said, there is some doubt on this, but we can imagine that Buddhism was, in a sense, a reaction to the problem of religious authority in India, namely the problem that religious authority was centered on a particular caste, the Brahminical caste, whose religious practices might have been seen as sort of stultifying, based on ritual, not allowing a lot of space for individual spiritual development. They would monopolize religious practice in the territories in which they had power. So we can view Buddhism, if not necessarily as a reaction to the Brahminical faith exactly, but almost certainly a reaction to that sort of religion. So Buddhism positions itself as a kind of reaction to religious traditions which have become ossified and governed by dogma and the precise discharge of particular rituals, and which offered people a more individualistic, we can imagine, a more spiritually fulfilling path on their religious quest, in which religious authority was more devolved and in which individual practitioners sort of had more authority over their own behaviors, their own goals, their own practices, and so on. So all of this is to say that we can see that these major world religious traditions all developed under very specific social and cultural conditions which were conducive to their flourishing. And they were conducive to their flourishing because these traditions did offer a kind of solution to pressing social and cultural problems that existed at the time in which these traditions emerged. But perhaps all this is still not quite enough to explain how and why it was that these major world religious traditions were able to develop, because it's not like they developed in isolation. There were other competing religious traditions at the time. There must have been other sectarian and cultic movements developing at the time. So why exactly was it that these particular faiths became successful, whereas so many other putative religious traditions, which also offer their own particular solutions to cultural and social problems, failed? And this leads us to one very important feature of many NRMs, which is consistently emphasized in the scholarly literature on these movements, and that is the presence of what has been termed charismatic authority in many of these movements. So charismatic authority refers to this idea that the instigators of particular movements, and typically these are individual people, though sometimes there might be small groups of people, who are able to instigate this movement and attract adherents at the initial stages purely through their own charismatic attraction, that they offer something that makes them credible in the eyes of people, which inspires people, something like this, and that most new religious movements which get off the ground are inspired by a single leader who commands a degree of respect and fealty and as a consequence is able to attract new adherents and to ensure that they stay in the fold and committed to this new movement. Now, the first thing to say is that when we're talking about charisma here, we are not referring to charisma in the everyday sense of this word. So when we describe leaders of NRMs as being charismatic, we're not saying that they have winning personalities, that they're smooth talkers, that there is necessarily anything compelling or attractive about their personalities. In fact, when you look at many of the leaders of these NRMs, they are actually distinctly uncharismatic in the conventional sense. If you look at videos on Osho, for example, who led his own movement, or the Reverend Moon, the leader of the Moonies, people like this, they are actually definitively uncharismatic people in the conventional sense of the word. They are not necessarily great public speakers. They don't necessarily say anything funny or interesting or anything like that. So when we're talking about charisma, we're talking about some other personal quality they might possess, which would lead them to be treated with respect and to attract people into their fold. So one important thing is that all of these charismatic leaders have to establish why it is that their teachings, that their movement should be taken as authoritative, why it should be treated as credible, as opposed to any other potential religious movement. And so what the leader of an NRM needs to do in order for his movement to be successful is to engage in a set of strategies which serve to establish his credibility, which serve to inspire people to follow him, and so on. And these methods tend to be relatively consistent across different religious movements. So one way for a leader of an NRM to attract followers and to establish his authority is to claim some kind of special or esoteric knowledge, and there are different ways that this can be done. So at the more prosaic level, we might have a leader of an NRM simply present themselves as a superior scholar, as a superior interpreter of an existing religious tradition. So many of the revivalist movements in Christianity in the 18th and 19th centuries were founded by guys who didn't necessarily claim any sort of miraculous knowledge of God or supernatural knowledge. They just claimed to be superior interpreters of the existing tradition. So we've already talked about the Jehovah's Witnesses, and the guy who essentially launched this movement, Charles Russell, so he never claimed to be a particularly special person. He didn't claim to have any supernatural insights or anything like that. He just claimed to be a superior interpreter of the Bible, and he published many, many books, many commentaries on the Bible, many theological tracts, and it was through this supposedly superior scholarly knowledge that he was able to attract followers and attract people to his movement. In a slightly different vein, we have L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, who was able to establish his authority by writing a number of books on pseudoscientific topics, which many people took seriously. Many people took him to be really the discoverer of some very important psychological principles, let's say, and even today Scientologists venerate L. Ron Hubbard as a sort of exemplary intelligence, as opposed to someone with any sort of supernatural powers. But then there are leaders of NRMs who claim to have authority on the basis of the revelation of supernatural knowledge. So again, this can take different forms. So particularly within the Eastern religious traditions, when you have Hindu gurus or Buddhist teachers and so on, their authority might stem from certain supernatural insights that they have been able to glean through meditation or other forms of religious practice. So they will set themselves up, particularly in the Buddhist case, as having authority due to their enlightened status. In other cases, people might claim divine revelation for their extraordinary knowledge. So Joseph Smith, who founded Mormonism, of course, claimed to be in possession of a set of tablets which represented a new revelation from God. In some cases, you have wannabe prophets who will insist that they are actually in communication with God. So Baha'u'llah, for example, claimed actually to be a manifestation of God, but he claimed that his writings were revelatory, so they were not his words, but rather God was speaking to him. So this is obviously an echo of the revelation of the Quran. Another way that leaders of NRMs traditionally demonstrate their authority is through the production of miraculous or otherwise extraordinary deeds. So we have some very common tropes here again. So a very common trope is the idea that this leader is capable of healing people. So many gurus in India will make this claim, for example. Many preachers in charismatic Christian movements will also invite people up to the stage. You've probably seen videos of this. They'll put their hands on people who will start to writhe around, and the preacher will then claim the person has been healed. So this is one way for them to establish their authority. In other cases, there are other miraculous events that they might attempt to pull off. So Satya Sai Baba, who we mentioned earlier, he would manifest things like gold. So if you watch the videos, he's basically shaking his sleeve, a gold necklace comes out, and that is treated as a miracle. So that's not going to be terribly convincing, I think, to a lot of people, but the point is it's convincing enough to the people who want to believe him. It is a sign of his authority, it's a sign of his special nature that he is able to perform miraculous deeds like this. And one final way that a leader might attempt to establish his authority over a community is by claiming that he holds a special or extraordinary nature, particularly with respect to God. So, for example, Ahmad, who was the founder of this Ahmadiyya movement that we mentioned earlier, so he claimed to be the Messiah of God. Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, as we mentioned, he claimed to be a manifestation of God. Satya Sai Baba claimed to be a reincarnation of an earlier Indian guru, and although I'm not sure if he ever claimed this directly, but certainly his followers later came to believe that he was an incarnation of the god Vishnu as well. So this is one other strategy, a rather more extraordinary strategy that a leader might use. But if you can claim to be somehow a special individual who has a special relationship to God, that's another way to establish your authority over the community. And another key feature of charismatic authority in NRMs is the ability of leaders to engage in what has been termed collective myth-making. So leaders in NRMs typically are not these flighty, distant figures who are pronouncing certain doctrines to people and expecting them to obey, but rather they do seem to be able to develop a kind of relationship, or at least a parasocial relationship with followers, and to make the followers believe that they are really part of a bigger movement, part of a bigger experience, and that they are in some sense forging their own futures, and the leader is simply the facilitator of the followers to achieve this. So a lot of NRMs make sort of very big universalizing claims. They might claim to be on the path to saving humanity, something like this, reawakening humanity, saving the world somehow. A lot of religious movements make these very bold claims. They are going to transform society. They're going to usher in an age of peace. And these don't need to be eschatological claims, although, this is a strategy as well. Maybe the leader will tell them that the end of the world is coming and things are going to be better because God or someone else is going to intervene. But very often, these new religious movements encourage sort of pro-social behavior. So something like the Moonies, for example, they were encouraged to go out and pick garbage and to talk to people and things like this. And so it made them believe through these charitable acts and through these pro-social behaviors that they really were contributing in a very direct and concrete sense to the improvement of society. And when you look at established NRMs, they always have this rhetoric that they are promoting peace, they are promoting love, they have a very important mission. And when a leader of an NRM can really make their followers internalize this idea, the idea that they are on a collective journey that really is very meaningful and purposeful, again, that is going to lend their leadership a degree of charismatic authority. And then there's a whole bunch of, I would say, much more mundane practices that a charismatic leader can employ to demonstrate his charismatic authority. This can perhaps be best illustrated with the account of a meeting that a British scholar had with Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, and how he recounts that in his later letters. So here he is describing the experience, and see if you can pick up on some of these particular features, some of the things that the charismatic leader is doing in order to create an environment, let's say, in which his claims to authority are more likely to be taken seriously. So this comes from the writings of a Professor Edward Granville Brown, describing his meeting, as I said, with the Baha'u'llah. You'll have to excuse the language here. It's that very sort of Victorian verbose style of speaking. But he writes, quote, "My conductor paused for a moment while I removed my shoes. Then, with a quick movement of the hand, he withdrew, and as I passed, replaced the curtain. And I found myself in a large apartment, along the upper end of which ran a low divan, while on the side opposite to the door were placed 2 or 3 chairs. Though I dimly suspected whither I was going and whom I was to behold, a second or two elapsed here. With a throb of wonder and awe, I became definitely conscious that the room was not untenanted. In the corner where the divan met the wall sat a wondrous and venerable figure, crowned with a felt headdress of the kind called Taj by dervishes, round the base of which was wound a small white turban. The face of him on whom I gazed I can never forget, though I cannot describe it. Those piercing eyes seemed to read one's very soul. Power and authority sat on that ample brow, while the deep lines on the forehead and face implied an age which the jet-black hair and beard flowing down in indistinguishable luxuriance almost to the waist seemed to belie. No need to ask in whose presence I stood, as I bowed myself before one who is the object of a devotion and love which kings might envy and emperors sigh for in vain." End quote. So, firstly, there are obviously going to be some personal characteristics of charismatic leaders which are maybe a little bit more intangible, but which can contribute to their aura of authority. So reference here to things like his appearance, his piercing eyes, things like body language here are going to be very important as well. If you are able to confidently convey a message, to speak with a certain gravitas and authority, that is going to assist your claims to legitimacy as well. But more important here is to take note of the particular space, the particular environment in which the Baha'u'llah receives guests, the kind of way that he presents himself, the kind of situation in which he demands others approach him. So firstly, it is set up in a way that there is a kind of ritual to the meeting of this guy. So he has helpers who are drawing back curtains, shoes need to be removed. So there is this process of expectation and wonder that Brown describes. This is all, I'm sure, very deliberate. It creates a kind of space, a kind of distance between the religious leader and the ordinary person. The ordinary people have to approach the leader in a sort of state of supplication, almost. In fact, Brown here describes the meeting as like meeting an emperor, meeting a king, and this is something very typical for leaders of NRMs. Whenever you see them communicating with their followers, there is always a clear distinction between who is the leader and who is the follower. So the leaders are often sitting on things like thrones or special chairs. They're wearing special kinds of dress. The followers are expected to approach them with heads bowed, with hands clasped in prayer, something like this. And so the demonstration of authority here takes on an almost theatrical quality. It's like the leader is deliberately and very ostentatiously playing this role of a leader. And as silly as it sounds, it works. If you play the role of a leader, you'll very often find that other people are happy to play the role of a follower. These sorts of displays, these sorts of behaviors, they really can affect the behavior and the attitudes of other people. And you can see the effect that it had on this Professor Brown simply by being presented with the Baha'u'llah in this particular context, in this particular way. It obviously made a very striking impression on him. And again, this is not accidental. This is a very deliberate strategy whereby there are certain ways that leaders of charismatic movements can shape the environment in which they dwell in order to give off this aura of legitimate charismatic authority. And this is a process that has been very well studied in the scholarly literature on the nature of religion. So I've mentioned Anne Taves before on this podcast, and she writes about the importance of the generation of sacred spaces in religious practice. So typically, if you want people to place stock in the kinds of religious ideas and practices that you are attempting to sell, it normally doesn't work simply to tell them these ideas, to tell them what to do. Rather, you want to create a kind of environment, one that is very emotionally charged, one that is rich with symbolism, something like this, that is going to make those ideas and practices seem more credible. So in this case, Baha'u'llah has achieved this through a kind of intimacy where the professor has been invited into a sacred space that is very literally closed off from the rest of the world, in this case, by the use of a curtain. So he creates a kind of sacred space in which sacred ideas, the sacred ideas that he's about to propound to the professor, are able to take on a higher degree of credence than they would if he was just trying to explicate these ideas, on a street corner or something. So Baha'u'llah uses this technique of intimacy to create a sacred space. In other NRMs, a sacred space is created through a kind of mass movement where you have hundreds or thousands of people together in a room. Again, this kind of environment in which there is a very large group of people who are, at least in theory, unified in purpose. This can also send a very strong message to followers. It also creates a very salient sacred space in which the ideas are more likely to be taken as credible than they would be, again, if they were just written down in a book or spoken to you at a cafe or something like that. So the mere manipulation of particular environments can lend credibility to the charismatic authority of the leaders of these NRMs. But we should also note that this is once again a very collective process, so it's not as though the leader is generating all of this aura just by himself, but rather it takes the complicity of his followers and his community to lend credence to these particular ideas and practices as well. So you see here in this example that Professor Brown was shown into the room by particular followers of Baha'u'llah. So undoubtedly, even before Professor Brown stepped foot in the room, they would have been creating an environment of awe, which Professor Brown notes, requiring Professor Brown to go through very particular rituals, taking off his shoes and so on. In other cases, it might be things like washing your hands or washing your feet. There are many of these little processes that a community might insist upon that again contribute to the particular aura, the particular charisma that their leader possesses. So this kind of myth-making about the special nature of the leader of a new religious movement, this is not a unilateral process. As I've said, it requires the complicity of the community as well. They themselves have a particular interest in generating sacred spaces, in generating a particular aura around their leader, and so it becomes a kind of self-reinforcing process in a way where followers are establishing this kind of environment, these kind of expectations, and these don't just filter through to outsiders like Professor Brown who are entering the space for the first time, but it affects the very followers themselves. So if they are engaged in these practices which generate feelings of awe or some other strong, very salient emotion like this, it also affects their own beliefs, their own practices. They collectively vest their own actions with a huge degree of significance. There is a very overt performative aspect to all this. It's almost a kind of play, in the words of T.M. Lerman, where if you want to really believe that the leader of your community has these special powers, these special abilities, all you really have to do is to act as though he really does. And through these particular actions, these pretenses, these performances, a very real sense of aura, of credibility, can therefore be applied to the leader. So it's not as though people are being brainwashed here into joining NRMs. I think that idea has been completely discredited, but there still has to be this element of submission, of a desire, really, for these particular claims of the leader of an NRM to be true. People don't just fall into these religious movements. They are there because they want to be, because these movements fulfill some kind of personal need within them. And so they are happy to go through these pretenses, these processes of legitimacy building, in order to ensure that their beliefs and practices can be viewed as credible in their own eyes. And there is a lot of religious language, a lot of religious practice that is auto-communicative in this sense. So when a Christian, for example, says, Jesus loves me, Jesus has saved me, they're not just saying this for the benefit of other people, it's also a message of encouragement to themselves. And a lot of the myth-making which surrounds the creation of charismatic leadership in NRMs serves exactly the same function. So people in these movements are not simply submitting to the will of a leader because he just happens to be so persuasive, so charismatic, but rather people are submitting to leadership in these contexts because that is exactly what they want. They want to believe in the special nature of the leader. They want to believe in the specialness of his message, and they want to believe that this is all true. So they are going to go through processes which legitimate the charismatic authority of the leader because it serves their own interests as much as it serves the interests of the leader. So what can this teach us about the origins of the established faiths? Well, of course, most of the established faiths that we are familiar with did have their origin with a single man. So certainly Christianity, Islam, Sikhism, Buddhism. And although, of course, it's going to be very difficult to know what these men were actually like, exactly what techniques they were using to attract people to their movement, we can certainly imagine that all of the things we've just discussed, in terms of charismatic authority and what it involves, would apply to the founders of these established religious traditions just as much as it applies to the founders of the NRMs we have just discussed. So all of the founders of these established religious traditions have, for example, tried to establish their authority by appealing in some way to their extraordinary knowledge. So at the more prosaic level, for example, we have someone like Confucius, who in his writings pretty explicitly makes it known that he does not believe that he is promulgating some new message. Rather, what he's trying to do is to recapture the sort of religious spirit of his forebears. So this is, of course, an echo of the rhetoric of sectarian groups, this logic that we are not actually promoting something new, we're simply trying to return to a more pristine form of an established religious tradition. But Confucius never claimed to have any special supernatural powers. He didn't claim to have any supernatural insights into the nature of reality. Rather, he referred to himself as a scholar. This is the Chinese term ru. And in fact, subsequent generations of Confucians didn't refer to themselves as Confucians. Again, they simply refer to themselves with this term ru, scholar. And in subsequent Confucian history, although Confucius has been, I would say, partially deified in some strands of Confucianism, particularly in Neo-Confucianism, which came much later, but generally Confucians refer to Confucius as a scholar or as a great teacher, as opposed to someone who had some supernatural insight into the nature of the cosmos. Interestingly, there's a similar sort of rhetoric in the gospel accounts of Jesus, where although, of course, he is presented as a superlative figure, as a prophet, as someone with a very close relationship to God, he is also presented as an authority by virtue of his superior scholarly understanding of Jewish law and Jewish texts. So the Gospels repeatedly present Jesus as winning debates with Pharisees, for example, demonstrating his superior knowledge of the law. The Gospel of Luke even presents the adolescent Jesus as a very sort of precocious kid who was, again, able to win debates with the Jewish authorities of the time. And even in the Gospels, he is referred to as rabbi, as teacher. So although, of course, there is an extraordinary element to Jesus' authority as well, there is still this rhetoric in the Gospels that he is to be trusted as an authority based on his superior worldly knowledge of the Jewish faith. Then, of course, these founders of the established religious traditions are also presented as possessing some kind of supernatural knowledge as well. So in the case of the Buddha, for example, his techniques granted him the possibility of achieving enlightenment, which gave him a unique understanding of the cosmos and the way that the world works. So it's not necessarily supernatural in the sense that it was imposed on him from without, at least within the rhetoric of Buddhist mythology. It's typically presented as a kind of process that theoretically anyone could go through, but the end result is a kind of knowledge that is certainly, if not supernatural, then at least preternatural or extraordinary in nature, and the Buddha is certainly presented as the first one to really achieve this state of mind. In Islam, of course, there is the revelation of the Quran. So Muhammad claimed to be receiving direct revelations from God, so that the knowledge that is presented in the Quran is not presented as the knowledge of a human being, but rather supernatural knowledge, the direct revelation of God himself. And there's a very similar rhetoric underlying the hymns and the texts produced by Guru Nanak, the founder of Sikhism. So here, the texts that are preserved in the Guru Granth Sahib, the holy text of Sikhism, are presumed not simply to be the words of a very clever man, but rather the product of divine inspiration in some way. So I'm not sure if Sikhs have the same attitude towards the Guru Granth Sahib that Muslims do to the Quran. They don't necessarily believe that it is literally the word of God, but certainly they believe it is divinely inspired, and that the Guru Nanak certainly had access to extraordinary, divinely inspired knowledge. Most of the founders of these established traditions are also depicted as buttressing their authority through the performance of extraordinary deeds. So, of course, in the case of Jesus, we have his resurrection, his various miracles, his healings, his raising people from the dead, his multiplication of the fish and loaves, and so on. The Buddha in Buddhist mythology is presented in a number of different ways, so it's very difficult to say this is what Buddhist mythology says about the Buddha, but certainly there are Buddhist myths which depict the Buddha as performing extraordinary deeds, as walking on water, and even having an extraordinary physical nature that, he radiates light, or he had special marks on his body, something like this. And in certain branches of Mahayana Buddhism, particularly Pure Land Buddhism, there is the notion that the Buddha is actually a kind of cosmic entity, so he's not just a man who reached enlightenment, but he is a kind of cosmic force with the power to redeem the world and the power to continue to exert an influence over the world, so functionally a god, really, in these traditions. So again, this extraordinary nature would go some way towards supporting his authority within the tradition. And although Muslims have typically attempted to avoid making Muhammad the center of worship in the faith in some way, there are still stories in the Ahadith which present him as performing fairly spectacular miracles, like, I think, stopping the moon from moving in the sky, moving mountains, things like this. So even though Islam has rhetorically attempted to downplay Muhammad's extraordinary nature, it is his revelation which is at the center of the faith, rather than any particular extraordinary powers that Muhammad himself possessed. But nonetheless, within the Islamic literature, the early Islamic ahadith, there is still this presentation of Muhammad as an extraordinary human being capable of performing miracles. And just like the founders of NRMs, all of these founders of the established traditions are also depicted as engaging in what we termed collective myth-making. So all of these founders of the established traditions were not simply preaching knowledge from on high, but rather they were engaged in the process of building communities, of providing particular institutions, particular practices, and particular ways of reorganizing the social world in which they lived. So Jesus, for example, was preaching the coming of the kingdom of God, like John the Baptist before him. And so his message was really pretty simple. It's that everybody should be getting themselves into a kind of state of moral and ethical purity in anticipation of the coming of the kingdom of God. So he essentially provided his followers with a reinterpretation of the Jewish law, so a new way to practice the Jewish law, a new way to live it out, that he believed was ethically superior to the mindless legalism of the Pharisees at his time. And just as importantly, he preached a kind of participatory eschatology, so the idea that his followers were somehow going to be involved either in bringing about the kingdom of God through their behavior, or at least certainly that they were going to be a major part of the kingdom of God when it arrived. So they would be sitting at his side, they would be sitting at God's side when the kingdom finally arrives. So he would have preached this very definite message that the religious duties that he expected his followers to perform were part of a uniquely transformative event in the history of the world, and that by following him, by engaging in these practices, they were not just living out their religious duty, but they really were engaged in a singularly transformative event in the history of the world. Muhammad too obviously preached this idea of developing a strongly knit community that had the real power to change the course of events, certainly in Arabia, and as it turned out, throughout most of the rest of the world as well. So his message was one of submission to Allah and to his own charismatic authority, and that through this it would produce a kind of political and religious centralization in the peninsula. It would permit the community to return to a purer, more ethically salutary form of monotheism that had gone missing from the peninsula. And it must have been pretty obvious, even to the earliest followers of Muhammad, that something pretty extraordinary was taking place. He did have some setbacks initially in his prophetic career, but by the time of his death in 632 AD, he had already consolidated a great chunk of the peninsula under the control of this nascent religious group. It had already achieved a great deal in terms of its religious and political goals, so certainly that very first generation of Muslims must have seen very strongly that they really were part of a collective process that was going to change the world, and that is something that would have certainly contributed to Muhammad's authority there, so his worldly achievements would have lent backing to the more abstract theological claims he was making, and it would have encouraged commitment to the group. It would have encouraged people to really believe that there was something singularly special about this nascent Islamic faith, which would motivate them to join the group and to remain as adherents, even when times got tough. The Buddha too established his authority by encouraging his followers to engage in this collective myth-making, whereby once more they were part of a process, part of a movement, which really was going to change the world in a very important way. So we don't know what the earliest followers of Buddha might have looked like. We don't know what the earliest Buddhist communities might have looked like, but probably based on later Buddhist history, we can imagine that there was a very strong monastic focus in early Buddhism. So Buddha would have encouraged his followers to come together into groups, into kinds of schools, and to engage in collective practices, to separate themselves from the wider profane society, and to engage in a purer form of religious practice, which he claimed was going to deliver an escape from suffering, an escape from the wheel of samsara, and so on. So again, this community, the kinds of practices that this early community was committing to, were not just these arbitrary practices. They were not just doing these things because the Buddha told them it might have been a good idea, but the Buddhists, the early Buddhists that is, really believed that they were engaging in practices that was going to change their relationship to the world. They were going to view the world in a different way. They were going to stand in an entirely new relationship to the order of things. And so, again, there would have been this collective myth-making element where all of the early Buddhists in these early monastic communities really would have believed that they were engaging in something very, very transformative and very important. Now, when it comes to the more idiosyncratic ways that these founders of the established faiths might have established their authority within the community, of course, we simply don't have the historical data to know what kind of body language they used, how they used sacred spaces, what it was that they wore. So I'm sure that in all of these cases, the founders of the established traditions would have used these markers. They would have used a particular style of speaking which conveyed confidence and gravitas. They probably separated themselves from others in the early community by the way that they were dressed, by the way that they might have positioned themselves when providing teaching. So, for example, probably they would have stood up in an elevated place to signify their elevated position. So I'm sure that all of these particular strategies would have been employed by these founders of the established traditions, but of course we can't know exactly what it was that they were doing because we just simply don't have reliable records about their lives and about the particular way that they carried themselves at the time of their establishment of their faiths. But as we mentioned earlier in the context of NRMs, the construction of charismatic authority in a religious tradition does not just come from the leaders themselves, but it's rather a collective process whereby the followers imbue the leader with this charismatic authority. They collectively attribute extraordinary properties to him. And this is certainly something that we see in the myth-making and the hagiographies of the early communities when they were writing about these leaders. So in the case of Christianity, of course, we have the Gospel authors and Paul, who attribute extraordinary qualities to Jesus. The Ahadith attribute extraordinary properties to Muhammad. The Buddhist myths do the same with the Buddha, and so on. And one particular way that they establish this charismatic authority, the way that they build up a kind of charismatic authority in their leaders, is by attributing to them the property of something like moral infallibility. So in the case of Christianity, actually, it's interesting that in the Gospel of Mark, the earliest account of Jesus' life, Jesus is still presented as possessing certain human foibles, so he appears to be quite angry at some times. He doesn't appear to understand fully what's happening to him, so there is not really the sense that he is omniscient in the sense you would normally expect of a divine being. But certainly later Christian hagiographies about the nature and the life of Jesus elevated him to a position of moral perfection. So in the Gospel of John already, you have this depiction of Jesus as basically a perfectly irenic, docile sort of lamb who had a perfect understanding of and control over everything that was happening to him. And later Christian myth-making, of course, even attributed that property to Mary, that she was in a state state of moral immaculateness when she conceived Jesus, but certainly most Christians would believe that Jesus is essentially morally perfect. Similar rhetoric in the Ahadith pertaining to Muhammad. So here in the Islamic tradition, the Sunnah literature, Muhammad is portrayed as a moral exemplar par excellence. So basically anything that Muhammad is depicted as doing in the Sunnah literature or the Ahadith is to be taken as morally salutary, as something to be emulated. So there is literally nothing that Muhammad is depicted as doing in his life that would be in any way morally questionable or dubious. In the case of the Buddha, I think it's almost tautological to say that a truly enlightened being is incapable of committing ethical atrocities. So simply by becoming enlightened, the Buddha also would have inherited these properties of moral perfection. And the community can also buttress the charismatic authority of these founders in other ways as well. So as we've said, progressively throughout time, the myths surrounding these founders will eventually become more and more extraordinary, more and more elaborate. They will have more and more supernatural powers attributed to them as the myth building goes on throughout time. They will certainly be presented as being superior, if not perfect, in knowledge. They'll be depicted by their followers as always winning debates with their detractors. This is a very common theme, certainly in the Gospels, the Ahadith, the mythology of the Buddha. They are always presented as being vastly superior in knowledge to all of those who are attempting to knock them down. So again, by depicting the founders in this way as superior fonts of knowledge, this also, of course, contributes to their charismatic authority in the eyes of the early communities. And actually, what's extraordinary, so we haven't mentioned here very much Judaism, Hinduism, Taoism, for example, because these are traditions which don't actually seem to have any single founder. But what is extraordinary to me is that in the subsequent myth-making of these traditions, even though there weren't really any particular historical figures which were responsible for founding the faith, these traditions still found a way to invent historical figures which served exactly that function of charismatic authority that these unambiguously historical figures like Jesus, Muhammad, and the Buddha serve in those respective faiths. So in the case of Judaism, for example, there was the mythological invention of figures like Abraham and Moses, who were depicted as having an extraordinary relationship to God. In the case of Moses, he was responsible for the revelation of divine knowledge, of course, through the Ten Commandments and the other aspects of Jewish law. But both of these figures were presented as having a very close relationship to God, not necessarily morally perfect, but certainly men who were to be taken as exemplars for subsequent generations. In the case of Hinduism, again, there is no single person at the heart of the faith, but the Vedic literature, in a way, takes the place of a human leader. The Vedic literature in Hinduism are vested with the same sort of charismatic authority that the leaders of these other established traditions were. So the Vedic literature in the Hindu rhetoric is taken as something uncreated, as something timeless, and as revealing extraordinary divine knowledge. So here you don't have charismatic authority coming through a single person, but rather charismatic authority which stems from particular religious texts. And in the subsequent history of Hinduism, various figures, so certain gurus, or more importantly, certain members of the priestly caste, the Brahminical caste, were also portrayed as possessing charismatic authority in themselves, not least because they were the only ones in the community who were allowed to, who were able to read the Vedic literature, and so to pass on knowledge to ordinary people. So even here in Hinduism, which has no central authority, which has no historical founders, there was still this invention of charismatic authority that has been attributed to the literature of the faith, the Vedic literature, and to particular special groups of people, namely the priestly caste, within that faith. And in the case of Taoism, its central text has been attributed to a guy called Lao Tzu, who almost certainly actually never existed. So even the name Lao Tzu translates just to something like old master, something like that. But we know that the Tao Te Ching was written in various stages, probably over the period of many hundreds of years. So certainly we know that the first half and the second half of the Tao Te Ching were written at different times. It's incredibly unlikely that the entire text was written by a single person. It's almost certainly a composite text constructed over many centuries by various religious figures connected with this tradition. But Taoism still had the need to invent a figure behind this Lao Tzu, to posit him as a historical figure with extraordinary knowledge, with pseudo-divine powers even, because again, this is a way of establishing charismatic authority within the faith. So what all these examples go to show is that even if there was not a single charismatic authority within the history of the faith, which led to the faith's development, there is still this need felt by followers to vest their traditions with this kind of charismatic authority. So if no appropriate historical figure can be found, they can simply be invented, and all of the properties that are ascribed to unambiguously historical religious figures like Jesus, Muhammad, and the Buddha can also be attributed to purely fictional individuals, and it serves essentially exactly the same function. This is still an aspect of collective myth building. It's still an aspect of how authority and legitimacy can be established within a particular religious tradition. And here, the historicity of the founders, of people involved in the promulgation of the faith, is actually largely irrelevant. As long as a figure can be constructed, as long as that figure can be vested with charismatic authority, that serves exactly the same function. Because, as we've said, charismatic authority is as much about the community as it is about the extraordinary powers of individual people. And we can finish this episode by looking at one other aspect of authority in new religious movements and what that can teach us about the origins of these established traditions. So here we'll be looking at how authority is passed on once these individual leaders who are possessed of charismatic authority eventually die, and how the community is therefore able to navigate this gap in authority which is created by the death of this leader. And this is an important topic in the context of NRMs, because what we find is that the overwhelming majority of new religious movements that are generated actually die out within 1 or 2 generations of the death of its founder. And while I've seen conflicting statistics on this issue, a common figure seems to be that only about 1 in 1,000 NRMs actually survive past the 100-year mark. So 99.9% of all new religious movements will be extinct within 100 years of their foundation. And a very big reason for this is that if you have a movement that is founded on charismatic authority, it's going to be very difficult to replace that charismatic authority with something opposite in order to keep the movement going. If this is a movement founded on the charismatic authority of a single individual, the question for these new religious movements has to be, how do we keep this movement together when it happens, as it inevitably will, that the leader dies? So the main problem here is that even if you have a group that is relatively cohesive, and even if all of its members are at least superficially unified on matters of theology or matters of practice, there are still going to be very different ideas held by different members of that community about the future direction of the community. So you might have people, for example, who believe that the faith should seek to expand itself, or others who believe that the faith should withdraw in upon itself and sort of recede from the world. You might have people who believe that the faith should take a more liberal interpretation of particular doctrines. You might have people who believe that they should go in a more conservative direction. So there are any numbers of potential points of disagreement, and really all human beings, all members of a religious community, are going to interpret their faith in slightly different ways. And these slight differences can be magnified when there is a struggle for power over who is to lead the community after the death of the leader, and therefore what particular direction the community will head in. And of course, to be clear, sometimes the aims and the goals of the people jostling for power are not quite so innocent as all that, so you can have the ordinary venal human concerns about access to power and wealth and so on, which might also contribute to the squabbles which occur after the death of a leader. But even if we assume the best intentions of all parties, there are inevitably going to be disagreements about the nature and the future of the community. And so with the death of a leader who has been vested with this charismatic authority, there is going to be a gap. There are going to be fights about who will lead the community in the future. And while, as we'll see in a moment, groups don't necessarily need a single leader or a clear hierarchical leadership structure in order to stay together, there are more diffuse ways that a religious tradition can establish authority within itself, but there has to be some authority. If the group is not unified behind the same authority within the faith, that is how schisms happen, that is how groups fracture, and particularly in the case of new religious movements, this is how they simply fall apart. If the members of the group are not unified in respecting the same authorities, if they don't vest the same people, the same organizations, or even the same physical artifacts with authority, then more likely than not, they are going to fall apart. And as we've said, that is really the case for 99.9% of all religions that have ever been created. So the question therefore becomes, how can you get an entire community of believers to unite behind a particular authority once this established authority disappears, once the original leader dies? Well, if you look at the most successful new religious movements, the leaders of these movements have tended to leave their communities a very clear succession plan about what the community should look like after they depart. So probably the simplest way to achieve this is for the leader to simply appoint an heir before he dies. And very typically this heir is going to be someone either within the leader's own family or someone closely associated with the leader. So this is the case in the Baha'i faith, for example, where Baha'u'llah appointed his son to lead the Baha'i community after his death. It's the case with the Moonies, where the Reverend Moon appointed again his son to lead the community after his death. It happened with the Raelians as well, where the founder of that tradition named a close companion of his to succeed his leadership of the community. So this doesn't stamp out challenges to authority altogether, as we'll see, even where the leader who is vested with charismatic authority directly appoints a single leader to take his place. That doesn't stop challenges to the authority of this new leader, but it does make it a lot easier for the community to continue when they've been given a clear instruction about who is to take the place of this leader once the leader departs. But perhaps an even more surefire way for a leader to ensure the continuity of his group once he dies is to create an actual formal organization who, once he dies, will be responsible for overseeing the community, for making particular decisions on theology and practice, and so on. And again, most of the successful NRMs in the contemporary world have done exactly this. So Sathya Sai Baba, for example, created an organization in his own name, which is now responsible for overseeing his community. We see this with the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses, where the founders of these religious traditions also created very clearly defined organizations within their own lifetime, which would allow a degree of continuity in the faith once the leaders departed, even in the Baha'i faith. So, as I mentioned, Baha'u'llah appointed his son to be the successor to him, but he even saw further into the future than that and advocated eventually for the establishment of what he called the International House of Justice, and this was finally established in the Baha'i faith in the 1960s. So now there is no single leader of the Baha'i faith, rather all of these decisions are taken by a particular council that is run from within this organization that Baha'u'llah himself agitated for the creation of. Now, as I've said, even when a successor is appointed, or even where a leader is able to create a stable institution in his own name, that doesn't stop the squabbling altogether. In all of these faiths that I have just mentioned, in all of these NRMs, there have been leadership disputes upon the death of the leader. Some of these produced, really sort of minority fringe factions within the group who never really garnered any base of support. But in other cases, such as in the Baha'i faith, in Mormonism, there were more robust challengers that went on to found their own sort of separate religious movements because they were not happy with the leadership of the new leader. But in all of these cases, there was at least some dissent. Upon the death of the leader, all of these movements had their own countercurrents within them, which challenged the authority of what the leader proclaimed should be left in his stead. But despite that, all of these faiths have been successful in the world. They all count millions of adherents worldwide. They are all more than 100 years old. That makes them profoundly successful as new religious movements. And as I've said, I think that a big reason for their success can be attributed to the foresight of their founders in appointing successors and creating organizations which permit the religious community to continue with an established, unified sense of authority, even upon the death of the leader. Now, the interesting thing is that none of this really applies to the established religious traditions of the world. So all of them now have some kind of formal organizational structure. There are clear and established religious authorities, which members of these religious groups are unified in supporting. But in most cases, with these major world religious traditions, it actually took a long time to develop these organizations and to establish that sense of authority. So in none of these world religious traditions, which were founded by a single individual, with the partial exception of Sikhism here, was there ever any clear indication of who was to succeed the founders of these faiths as leaders of the community, and neither did any of these founders appear to have created any robust, stable organizational structures which would permit the community to continue upon their death. So Jesus, for example, perhaps because he believed in an imminent eschatology, so he believed the world was about to end, so there was really no sort of sense in creating these abiding religious organizations, but he doesn't seem to have left his community with any clear instructions about what was to be done after his death. So much of the first century of Christianity was a state of division, really. There were lots of different factions within Christianity jostling for power. So we know that the apostles of Jesus, so particularly Peter and James, established a sort of Jewish-centric Christianity based in Jerusalem. But Paul came along and he was preaching a message that was more tailored for the Gentile population. And so much of the original division in Christianity was about the role that old Jewish practices, particularly the observation of the Jewish law, was to play in the coming faith. But at the time of Peter and James and Paul and the kinds of debates they were having, there was no single established leadership within the Christian world. And in fact, we know from the writings of Paul that there doesn't seem to have been any sort of clear leadership structure, even within individual churches. There was a lot of emphasis placed on the charismatic authority of individuals and the performance of charismatic deeds, such as speaking in tongues and prophesying and so on. But at the earliest days of Christianity, we do not see any evidence of a clear leadership structure, of a clear place of authority within the tradition, other than the resurrected Christ himself and the belief in Christ as a cosmic figure. This was really the only thing holding these early Christian communities together. It's not until we get to the pastoral epistles, so the books of Timothy and Titus, where we first start to see some clear evidence of an organizational structure within Christianity. But even then, there were interminable debates for many centuries after that about the correct interpretation of Christian theology and the need to create a kind of orthodoxy, which itself would eventually pave the way for a Catholic, that is, universal church. But this creation of a stable religious organization with a clearly established authority behind which all Christians were notionally supposed to be unified took many, many centuries to create. And in the meantime, there were a number of conflicts surrounding who exactly in the Christian community should be taken as authoritative and what beliefs and practices should be taken as authoritative. In the case of authority within the early Islamic community after the death of Muhammad, the situation was even more dire and dramatic. So the sources are sort of conflicted on whether Muhammad appointed a successor or not. So one faction of early Muslims believed that he appointed his son-in-law Ali to take leadership of the community, whereas other factions believed that he had appointed Abu Bakr as his successor. And finally, the latter faction won out, so Abu Bakr became the first leader of the Islamic community after Muhammad. But not all Muslims have unified behind that idea, so if you want to understand the division between Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims, it really can be traced back to this point where Shia Muslims believe that Ali should have been appointed the first caliph of the early Islamic community. But whatever the case was, historically, certainly, apparently, Muhammad never publicly proclaimed who his successor should be. There was clearly some doubt about who his successor should be. And there were even sort of doubts about the kind of political structure that the Islamic community should take after Muhammad's death. So after his death, there were a series of conflicts referred to in Islamic historiography as fitnas, and these fitnas were essentially civil wars. So these were not just debates over ideas, these were physical conflicts, these were battles which led to many deaths, all of which surrounded the question of who was to take Muhammad's mantle and to take leadership of this nascent Islamic community. And finally, Abu Bakr and his successors established themselves as caliphs, and again, there isn't a lot of mention of this caliphate in the Quran, so again, it's a bit unclear if this is exactly the vision that Muhammad might have had for his community. But the caliphate did introduce a degree of centralization, a degree of formal authority within the Islamic community, though even then, of course, there were conflicts, there were murders, there was a lot of intrigue surrounding this authority. So basically, because Muhammad didn't clearly leave a succession plan in the event of his death, a lot of the first century or two of Islam was basically filled with conflict and with violence and with death, all surrounding the question of who should take leadership of this community, where the authority in the community should lie. Now, in the case of Islam, there was a kind of transcendent authority at hand, namely the Quran. So what all parties could at least agree on was this idea that the community should be centered around the Quran, that the Quran provided all of the answers about the beliefs and practices that this community should follow. So this is an example of charismatic authority not being placed in the hands of a particular individual, but in this case in the hands of a physical artifact. So this is also a legal move in the history of religious traditions, where if there are no individual people behind whom all can unify as a source of authority, there are still these more transcendent or symbolic forms of authority which individual people and individual interest groups can appeal to as a basis for the very worldly authority they wish to wield. So the Vedic literature in Hinduism and the Torah in Judaism, of course, serve a very similar function. In the case of Buddhism, the details here are a little bit more murky, so a lot of this is going to be speculative, but we can certainly imagine that the Buddha was a kind of itinerant teacher who went around many different parts of India preaching his message, teaching individual people the philosophy and the methods that he had developed, and also establishing monastic communities, so developing communities of monks in each part of the country that he visited. Now, what's going to happen when you have a number of different monasteries developed, a number of different monastic communities, is that each of these communities is going to develop their own sort of internal leadership structure, even if the community wasn't explicitly designed to have a formal or hierarchical structure. It's pretty natural that within a monastic community, you are going to have particular individuals who, as a result of their breadth of knowledge or their seniority, are going to take a more active role in the leadership of that community, who are going to be viewed as authorities unto themselves. And so it's easy to imagine in this situation that through creating all of these different monastic communities, the Buddha also inadvertently created a situation in which a kind of unified Buddhism would never really be able to take root. And whatever the case is, it certainly doesn't appear as though he left extremely clear instructions about exactly what subsequent Buddhist communities should look like after his death, because we know that within a century or two after his death, the Buddhist community had already split up into a number of different schools. There were councils convened to try to reach some sort of consensus about Buddhist belief or Buddhist practice, which were ultimately unsuccessful. But again, it seems pretty clear to me that the Buddha didn't leave any specific organizational instructions about what Buddhist communities were to look like after his death. So it's here, as I've said, that maybe we find a kind of disconnect between the dynamics of NRMs and the early dynamics of these established faiths, that where the successful NRMs tended to have had a very clear organizational structure where the founders of these movements have left very clear instructions about what was to be done with the community after their deaths. This actually, strangely, doesn't seem to have been the case with the major world religious traditions. So all of these traditions, of course, did eventually develop organizational structures and official forms of authority within their communities, but this took a long time. It was a very painful, often violent process, as we've seen. So I guess this goes to show that there is maybe not necessarily any one single good way of creating a religious tradition, but at the same time, certainly if we are looking at new religious movements, the ones that have been successful have been the ones that have tended to be well organized and in which the leaders have left very clear instructions about what was to happen after they depart. So, finally, we get to the end of this episode. At 3 hours, I think this is the longest one I've done yet. So hopefully you were able to make it through all of this and to learn something. So just to very quickly reiterate, my main point in creating this episode was to show that really there is nothing new under the sun when it comes to religions. There is nothing special or mystical or inexplicable about the origins of any of the world's faiths. We can explain them through very similar kinds of sociological and psychological processes. And so really, if you want to understand how it could be that a religion like Christianity or Islam were able to become so popular so quickly, all you need to do is to look at the Mormons or the Baha'is of today, and you will pretty much get your answer. So, with all of that finally said, I just want to thank you once more for listening. See you again next time. Bye-bye.